Drums. Elira heard the drums before she saw anything, and her hands froze around the basket of dried mint she had been arranging on the stall. The sound rolled through the market square like thunder trapped inside wood, and every head around her turned at once. She did not turn. She had learned long ago that turning toward danger only made it easier to find you. "They are close," said old Fenna, the woman who sold pickled roots 2 stalls down. Her voice trembled, though whether from excitement or fear, Elira could not tell. "The king's procession. I heard the guards talking at the gate this morning. He rides through on his way to the eastern summit." Elira's stomach tightened into a hard knot. She had known, in some distant way, that the roads might be busy today. Everyone in the village had whispered about it for a week, but knowing a thing and feeling it arrive were 2 very different experiences, and now the drums were so loud she could feel them in her chest, like a second heartbeat trying to force its rhythm into her own. She glanced down at her basket: dried mint, crushed chamomile, little bundles of willow bark tied with brown string. Her mother's remedies, made with her mother's hands until the sickness took her, and now made with Elira's own. She had walked 2 hours from the outskirts to sell them here, because market day in the capital brought better prices than anywhere else, and because winter was coming, and the cottage roof needed mending before the frost. She had not planned on this. "Clear the center path," a guard shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd like a blade through cloth. "Clear the path, in the name of the king." People surged backward, some laughing with excitement, children climbing onto their parents' shoulders to see better, others simply trying to get out of the way, before they were shoved aside by the approaching soldiers. Elira felt the crowd press in around her stall, bodies close and warm and smelling of sweat and market dust, and she pressed herself back against the wooden frame of the stall, as if she could disappear into it. She was not afraid of the king. Not exactly. She had never met him, had never even seen him from a distance, and in her small corner of the kingdom, his name was mostly just a word people used when they swore an oath or complained about taxes. What frightened her was something else, something older and colder, that lived in the back of her mind and never quite went away. She was unmated, unregistered, and unmated omegas who caught the wrong kind of attention did not always get to choose what happened to them next. Her mother had warned her about this since she was a girl. "Keep your head down at gatherings. Never make eye contact with a stranger's wolf. If soldiers come through, find a wall and put your back to it, and do not, under any circumstance, let yourself be seen standing alone in an open space." The kingdom's laws protected omegas on paper, but paper laws did little against a powerful pack that decided it wanted something, and everyone knew the stories of villages that had lost a daughter or a son to a passing alpha's whim. The family paid off or silenced before anyone could ask too many questions. Elira did not want to be a story like that. So when the drums grew louder, and the crowd grew thicker, and the first banners appeared at the far end of the square, deep red and black, embroidered with the sharp lines of a howling wolf, the royal crest of House Draven, she did the only thing that made sense to her in that moment. She ducked. She slipped around the side of her stall, crouching low behind the stacked crates of grain that old Fenna's neighbor used to prop up his awning, and made herself as small as she possibly could. The wood was rough against her shoulder. Dust tickled her nose. Somewhere above her, the drums kept beating, and now she could hear the deeper sound beneath them, the rhythmic thud of hooves on packed earth, dozens of horses moving in careful formation. She should not have been able to see anything from where she crouched. That was the point. But there was a narrow gap between 2 crates, just wide enough for a sliver of the square to show through, and despite every instinct telling her to close her eyes and wait it out, curiosity pulled at her the way it always had, the same curiosity that made her ask too many questions as a child, and got her scolded more than once for staring too long at things she had no business staring at. She looked. The procession was enormous. Riders in polished armor moved in tight lines, their capes the same deep red as the banners, cut clean and sharp against the gray autumn sky. Behind them came a carriage, black wood trimmed in gold, though its curtains were drawn, and Elira could not see who rode inside. Flanking the carriage were more soldiers, and behind them, servants and attendants, dozens of them, carrying banners and provisions, and the various trappings that came with moving an entire royal household from one place to another. But it was not the soldiers or the carriage or the banners that made Elira's breath catch in her throat. It was the wolf. He walked just ahead of the carriage, And even from her hidden vantage point, half blocked by crates, and squinting through a gap barely wider than her hand, Elira understood immediately that this was no ordinary wolf. He was massive, larger than any wolf she had ever seen or heard described, his fur black as the deepest part of night, and rippling with muscle beneath it as he moved. His head was held high, his golden eyes sweeping the crowd with a kind of intelligence that made the hair on Elira's arms stand up. This was not an animal being led through the streets. This was a king's other half, walking in his own right, commanding as much respect and fear as the crown itself. Everyone knew the stories about the Alpha King's wolf. They said he had not shifted back to his human form in public more than a handful of times since his coronation. They said his wolf form was so powerful that entire rival packs had surrendered simply upon seeing him approach. They said his name was Kale Draven, and that no one, not diplomat nor rival nor assassin, had ever managed to get close enough to threaten him, because his wolf sensed danger before it arrived, and dealt with it before anyone else even understood what was happening. Elira had heard all of this the way she heard most stories about the nobility, as something distant and unreal, the kind of thing that happened in songs and in other people's lives. Crouched behind a crate of grain, with dust in her nose, and her heart hammering against her ribs, she understood for the first time that it was not a story at all. It was real, and it was walking through her market square, close enough that she could hear the soft thud of his paws against the ground. She should have looked away. She told herself this later, over and over, in the quiet hours when she replayed the moment in her mind. She should have closed her eyes, or ducked her head, or done anything other than what she actually did, which was continue to watch, transfixed, as the great black wolf moved past the stalls with his golden eyes scanning the crowd, like he was searching for something he had not yet found. And then, without warning, he stopped. It happened so suddenly that the soldiers around him nearly collided into each other. One moment the wolf was walking in perfect step with the procession, his pace matched exactly to the horses beside him, and the next moment he simply stopped, all four paws planted, his massive body gone rigid as stone. The crowd noise dimmed. Even the drummers, several paces ahead, faltered when they realized something had gone wrong behind them, their rhythm stumbling and then falling silent altogether. Elira watched, frozen, as the wolf lifted his head and turned it, slowly, deliberately, toward the exact spot where she was hiding. Her heart stopped. For one terrible, endless second, she was certain he could not possibly be looking at her. It was impossible. She was tucked behind crates in the middle of a crowded market, one small woman among hundreds, with nothing about her to draw the attention of a king's wolf from halfway across the square. She told herself this, even as his golden eyes locked onto the narrow gap between the crates, even as his nostrils flared, drawing in a long, slow breath, even as every hair on his powerful body seemed to rise at once. "What is he doing?" someone near her whispered. "He's never broken formation before," said another voice, hushed and disbelieving. "Not once. Not in 5 years." Elira did not answer, because she could not have spoken even if her life depended on it. Her throat had closed entirely, and her hands, still pressed flat against the rough wood of the crate, had begun to shake. The wolf took a step forward, then another. The soldiers around him shouted, some reaching for his side, as though to physically stop him, but he shrugged them off with an easy shift of his shoulders, the way a mountain might shrug off a handful of pebbles thrown against it. He was moving now, deliberately, unmistakably, toward the stalls, toward her. "Move," Elira whispered to herself, though her body refused to obey. "Move. Move. You have to move." But there was nowhere to go. The crowd had pressed in tightly on every side, curious onlookers craning their necks to see what had caused the procession to stop, and behind her was only the solid wooden wall of the stall itself. She was trapped, as neatly and completely as if someone had built a cage around her on purpose, and the only thing moving toward that cage was the single most powerful creature in the entire kingdom. She heard him before she saw him fully, the soft huff of his breath, the near-silent pad of paws against packed dirt, and then the crate beside her shifted as his great head came around the corner, and Elira found herself staring directly into a pair of golden eyes that seemed to see straight through her, past her skin and bone, and all the careful walls she had spent her whole life building. She did not scream. She wanted to. some distant part of her mind noted almost calmly, but her voice had abandoned her entirely, leaving her crouched in silence, with her back pressed against rough wood, and her wide eyes fixed on the wolf now standing not 3 feet away. He did not growl, he did not bare his teeth or lower his head in the way she had always imagined a predator would before it struck. Instead, he simply looked at her, his massive chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths, and then, astonishingly, he sat. He sat, the way an ordinary dog might sit at its owner's feet, his golden eyes never once leaving her face, and something about the sheer strangeness of the gesture broke through Alira's terror just enough for a single confused thought to surface. He isn't going to hurt me. She did not know how she knew this. There was no evidence for it beyond the wolf's own stillness, the careful, almost gentle way he held himself now that he had found her. And yet the certainty settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward in slow, undeniable ripples. Around them, the crowd had gone very quiet. A few people had begun to whisper, their voices low and urgent, words like, impossible, and never seen him do that. And worst of all, he's chosen someone. Alira heard these words drift toward her like smoke, and each one made the knot in her stomach pull tighter. Move back, a soldier's voice barked, closer now, and Alira saw boots appear at the edge of her narrow field of vision, as several guards pushed through the crowd toward the stall. Everyone move back, give His Majesty's wolf space. The wolf did not move back. He remained exactly where he was, seated, patient, his gaze fixed on Alira, with an intensity that made her feel as though she were the only person left in the entire square. My lord, one of the guards said, his voice shifting into something more careful, more deferential, as he addressed the wolf directly, the way one might address a member of the royal family, which, Alira realized with a fresh jolt of alarm, he essentially was. My lord, the summit awaits. We must continue on. The wolf did not so much as glance at the guard. His golden eyes stayed exactly where they were, locked on Alira's face, and for one wild moment she thought perhaps he intended to stay there forever, an immovable wall of black fur and quiet intensity, until the world itself gave up trying to move him. Then, from somewhere behind the wall of soldiers now gathering around the stall, a new voice cut through the murmuring crowd, low and commanding, in a way that made even the hardened guards straighten their shoulders. Move aside. The crowd parted, and Alira caught her first glimpse of the man striding toward the stall, his red and black cloak billowing behind him despite the still autumn air, his expression a mixture of confusion and something else, something sharper, something that looked almost like disbelief. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair swept back from a face that carried the unmistakable weight of authority, the kind that did not need to be announced because it simply existed in the way he moved, the way the entire crowd instinctively stepped out of his path without needing to be told twice. Alira did not need anyone to tell her who this was. She knew, the same way she had known the wolf would not hurt her, a certainty that settled into her bones before her mind had even finished processing the sight of him. This was the Alpha King. Cale Draven approached the stall with quick, purposeful strides, his eyes flicking first to his wolf, seated and unmoving, and then, following the wolf's gaze, to the narrow space between the crates where Alira remained frozen, half hidden, fully exposed. Their eyes met. Alira would spend the rest of her life trying to describe what happened in that moment, and she would never quite manage it, because there were no words simple enough to capture something that felt less like an event and more like a change in the fundamental structure of the world. It was as though a string she had never known existed, stretched somewhere deep inside her chest, had suddenly been pulled taut, connecting her to this stranger across the short distance between them, with a force she could feel but not see. Cale went rigid. His breath caught, audible even over the noise of the crowd, and for a long moment he simply stood there, staring at her, with an expression she could not begin to interpret, something between shock and recognition, and a kind of desperate, hungry relief, as though he had been searching for something his entire life, without knowing what it was, and had just found it hiding behind a crate of grain in a crowded market square. Your Majesty, one of the guards began, clearly uncertain of what was happening, but eager to reassert some kind of order. Shall we clear the— No, Cale said, his voice quiet but absolute, cutting through the guard's words, as easily as his wolf had cut through the crowd. No one touches her. Alira's heart hammered against her ribs. She had spent her entire life trying to avoid exactly this kind of attention, had built her whole existence around staying small and unnoticed and safe, and in the space of a few terrifying minutes, all of that careful invisibility had shattered completely. The king of the entire realm was standing in front of her, staring at her as though she were the only thing in the world worth looking at, and his wolf remained seated beside her like a guardian who had already decided, without asking anyone's permission, that she belonged to him. She did not know what any of this meant. She only knew, with a certainty that terrified her more than anything else that had happened so far, that her quiet, careful life had just come to an end, and whatever came next, she had absolutely no way of stopping it. "Please," she finally managed to whisper, her voice barely audible even to herself. "I didn't mean any harm. I was only trying to stay out of the way." Something in Cale's expression softened, just slightly, the sharp authority in his eyes giving way to something gentler, though no less intense. He crouched down slowly, deliberately, bringing himself to her level, rather than looming over her the way his position would have entitled him to do, and when he spoke, his voice had lost the commanding edge it carried a moment before. "You've done nothing wrong," he said quietly. "I promise you that. Please, will you tell me your name?" Illyra looked from his face to the wolf still seated patiently beside him, and then to the ring of guards and onlookers now surrounding the stall on every side, dozens of eyes fixed on her, waiting, watching, and she understood with a sinking certainty that whatever answer she gave, there would be no going back to the quiet, invisible life she had known before the drums began to beat that morning. "Illyra," she said finally, her voice trembling but clear enough to carry. "My name is Illyra." The king repeated it softly, almost to himself, as though testing the shape of the word in his mouth, and behind him, his enormous black wolf let out a low, satisfied sound that was almost, though not quite, a sigh. The crowd had gone utterly silent now, every person in the square holding their breath, waiting to see what the Alpha King would do next. Illyra waited too, still crouched behind the crates, her whole body trembling, caught in a moment she had never asked for and could not begin to understand, while somewhere above them, the autumn sky pressed down gray and heavy, indifferent to the quiet upheaval unfolding in the market square below. Cale rose slowly to his feet, though he kept his gaze fixed on her, as though afraid that looking away even for an instant might cause her to vanish entirely. He extended a hand toward her, not with the impatient command of a king who expected to be obeyed, but with something closer to a question, an invitation she was free to refuse. "You don't have to hide anymore," he said, "not from me." Illyra stared at his outstretched hand, as though it were a live coal. Every instinct her mother had drilled into her screamed that she should refuse it, that reaching out and taking a king's hand in front of half the capital was exactly the kind of attention she had spent her whole life trying to avoid. And yet some other instinct, quieter but no less insistent, whispered that refusing him now, in front of his soldiers and his wolf and this enormous crowd, might carry its own dangers entirely. "Your Majesty," came a new voice, sharp with disapproval, and Illyra watched as an older man in fine gray robes pushed his way through the ring of guards. His face was lined with the particular kind of impatience that came from years spent managing other people's decisions. "The summit delegates are waiting at the eastern gate. We cannot delay the procession for..." "For what, Bertrand?" Cale asked, his voice deceptively mild, though Illyra noticed the guards nearby stiffen at the tone. "Finish that sentence." Bertrand's mouth snapped shut. He glanced at Illyra, then at the wolf still seated beside her, and something shifted in his expression, a calculation Illyra could not quite follow, but did not like the shape of. "Of course, Your Majesty," Bertrand said instead, his voice smoothing over into practiced neutrality. "I only meant to remind you of the schedule." Cale did not respond to him directly. Instead, he turned back to Illyra, and the hard edge that had crept into his voice softened again the moment his eyes found hers. "I have somewhere I must be today," he said, "a matter of some importance to the kingdom. I cannot avoid it, much as I wish I could stay and explain everything properly." He paused, and for the first time since he had crouched down in front of her, Illyra saw something like uncertainty cross his face, quickly hidden, but not quickly enough. "But I will not simply walk away and pretend this did not happen. Will you allow me to send someone to speak with you, once the summit has concluded?" Illyra's mind raced. A dozen warnings from her mother's voice crowded into her thoughts at once, each one insisting that this was exactly how such stories began, with a polite request that was really no request at all, dressed up in gentle words to make the inevitable feel like a choice. And yet Cale had not commanded her. He had not ordered his guards to take her, had not simply decided her fate the way she had always imagined a king would, the way every story about powerful alphas and vulnerable omegas seemed to end. He was asking. "I sell remedies here, most market days," she heard herself say, the words slipping out before she had fully decided to speak them. "Herbs, tonics for fever and pain. If someone wished to find me, they could ask for Alira, the herbalist's daughter, from the Eastern Hill village." Something flickered across Cale's face, an emotion too quick and too complicated for Alira to name, though it looked almost like relief mixed with something warmer, something that made her chest tighten in response despite every effort to remain guarded. "Thank you," he said quietly. Then, straightening, he turned to address the small crowd still gathered around them, his voice shifting back into the commanding register she imagined he used for matters of state. "Nothing unusual has happened here. My wolf caught a scent that concerned him, and I confirmed there was no danger. The procession will continue immediately." It was a lie, and everyone present knew it was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that gave people permission to stop staring, to return to their business, to pretend that they had not just witnessed something that would be whispered about in every tavern and kitchen in the capital by nightfall. The guards began ushering the crowd back, reforming the procession's protective ring, and slowly, reluctantly, the wolf rose from where he had been seated beside Alira. Before he turned to follow his king, the great black wolf paused and lowered his massive head toward her one final time. Up close, his golden eyes held none of the menace she had expected from such a creature, only a strange, steady warmth that seemed entirely out of place on something built for battle. Then, with a soft huff of breath that stirred the loose strands of hair around her face, he turned and padded back toward the waiting carriage, falling into step beside Cale, as though nothing at all had happened. Alira remained crouched behind the crates, long after the last of the procession had vanished from the square, the drums resuming their steady rhythm somewhere in the distance, growing fainter with every passing minute. Old Fenna appeared at her side eventually, crouching down with concern written across her weathered face. "Child," she said, her voice hushed, "do you understand what just happened?" Alira shook her head slowly, though in truth, some part of her understood perfectly well, even if she could not yet bring herself to say the words aloud. A king's wolf did not break formation for strangers. A king did not crouch in the dirt of a market square to ask a frightened woman's name. Whatever had happened between them in that brief, breathless exchange, it was not something that could be undone or forgotten, no matter how badly Alira wished, in that moment, that it could. She gathered her basket with trembling hands, the dried mint and chamomile scattered across the ground where she had knocked them over in her scramble to hide, and began the long walk back toward the eastern hills, the weight of 100 curious stares following her the entire way out of the capital, and the memory of golden eyes, both wolf and man, following her further still. 3 days after the procession, a stranger arrived at Alira's cottage on horseback, and her hands were shaking before he had even dismounted. She had spent every one of those 3 days trying to convince herself that nothing more would come of the strange encounter in the market square. The king had a summit to attend, matters of state far more important than a chance meeting with a herbalist's daughter, and surely, she told herself again and again while grinding herbs at her work table or mending the hole in the cottage roof, surely a man with an entire kingdom to manage would forget about her within a day. She had not truly believed it, not even as she told herself the words, but believing had never stopped her from hoping. The rider who approached her small cottage wore no armor and carried no obvious weapon, dressed instead in a simple traveling cloak the color of autumn leaves, though the fine stitching along its hem gave away that this was no ordinary messenger. He dismounted at the edge of her garden path and bowed, actually bowed, to her, which struck Alira as so absurd that for a moment she simply stared at him without responding. "Alira, daughter of Marin the herbalist?" he asked, straightening from his bow. "Yes," she said carefully, wiping her hands on her apron, though they were not particularly dirty, a habit born of nerves rather than necessity. "Who is asking?" "My name is Corwin. I serve in His Majesty's household." He reached into his cloak and produced a folded letter, sealed with a wax stamp bearing the same howling wolf crest Elira had seen embroidered on the royal banners. King Kale asked me to deliver this to you personally, and to wait for your answer. Elira took the letter with fingers that did not feel entirely steady. The wax seal cracked easily under her thumb, and she unfolded the parchment to find handwriting that was neat but clearly hurried, as though the person writing it had a great deal to say, and very little time in which to say it. Elira, I have thought of little else since the market square. I understand that what happened there was frightening and unexpected, and I have no wish to frighten you further by pressing too quickly for answers neither of us yet has. But I cannot simply pretend that nothing occurred between us, nor do I believe, from the way you looked at me, that you can pretend this either. I am asking you to come to the palace, not as a summons, but as an invitation. I wish to speak with you properly, away from crowds and staring eyes, so that we might understand together what this bond means, and what, if anything, either of us wishes to do about it. If you refuse, I will respect your choice and trouble you no further, though I confess, I hope you will not refuse. Corwin will wait for your answer and can bring you safely to the palace himself, should you agree. Kale. Elira read the letter twice, then a third time, searching each sentence for the hidden command she felt certain must be lurking somewhere beneath the polite words. She had grown up hearing stories about powerful men who dressed their demands in gentle language, who made cruelty sound like kindness, until it was too late to refuse. But the longer she stared at the letter, the more she found herself unable to locate any such trap within it. He had written that he would respect her choice. He had used the word if when speaking of her coming to the palace, not when. He said I could refuse, she said aloud, mostly to herself, testing the words. He did, Corwin confirmed, and something in his tone, a kind of quiet surprise, suggested that this was not standard practice for the royal household. Though I will say, my lady, in 5 years of service, I have never seen His Majesty write a letter himself, rather than dictating one to a scribe. He sat with that parchment for the better part of an hour, before he was satisfied with it. Elira looked down at the letter again, at the slightly uneven lines where the ink had pooled in places, evidence of a hand that had paused often to consider its words, rather than writing them in the smooth, practiced strokes of someone accustomed to command. It did not erase her fear entirely, but it softened the sharp edges of it, just enough that she found herself considering the impossible question seriously for the first time. What happens, she asked slowly, if I say yes, and then later I wish to leave? Then you would be free to leave, Corwin said without hesitation. His Majesty was quite clear on that point before I departed the palace. You are not being summoned as a prisoner, my lady. You are being invited as a guest. Elira thought of her cottage, small and drafty though it was, the only home she had ever known, filled with the ghost of her mother's presence in every jar of dried herbs and every worn wooden spoon. She thought of the market square, of golden eyes that had looked at her as though she were the only person in the world, of a king who had crouched in the dirt rather than commanding her to rise. And she thought, too, of the strange, undeniable pull she had felt in that moment, a sensation she had no name for but could not quite dismiss as imagination, no matter how badly some frightened part of her wished to. I have chores that need finishing, she said finally, and I would need to close up the cottage properly before I could leave for any length of time. Corwin's expression brightened, just slightly, though he was clearly practiced enough at his role to keep most of his reaction hidden. Take whatever time you need, my lady. I am in no hurry. It took Elira the better part of the afternoon to prepare, far longer than the actual tasks required, because her hands kept pausing mid-motion as doubt crept back in, only to be pushed aside again by the memory of that strange, magnetic pull she could not quite explain away. She banked the fire, covered her herb jars against dust, latched the shutters against the coming cold, and packed a small bag with a few changes of clothes and the wooden pendant her mother had left her, the only piece of jewelry she owned. By the time she stepped out of the cottage and locked the door behind her, the autumn sun had begun its slow descent toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet that reminded her, absurdly, of the royal banners she had seen only 3 days before. The journey to the palace took the better part of 2 hours, and Elira spent most of it in tense silence, watching the landscape shift from the familiar rolling hills of her childhood into something grander and more foreign, wide roads lined with tall trees, farmland giving way gradually to the outer buildings of the capital, until finally the palace itself rose into view. She had seen it before, of course, from a distance, its towers visible even from the market square on clear days. But she had never imagined she would approach it as anything other than a curious bystander, and the closer they rode, the more the sheer scale of the place pressed down on her. Stone walls stretching higher than any building she had ever stood beneath, gates wide enough to march an army through, guards posted at intervals along the walls who watched her passing with expressions she could not read. Corwin led her not through the grand front entrance, where a crowd of nobles and petitioners always seemed to be gathered according to what little she knew of palace life, but through a smaller side gate that opened onto a quiet garden courtyard, where the noise of the capital faded into a hush, broken only by the soft trickle of a fountain and the rustle of wind through carefully tended hedges. Cale was waiting there. He had changed out of the formal armor and cloak she remembered from the market square, dressed now in simpler clothing that made him look, for a moment, almost like an ordinary man, rather than the ruler of an entire kingdom. But the moment his eyes found hers across the courtyard, that illusion of ordinariness vanished entirely, replaced by the same intense, magnetic pull she remembered from their first meeting, stronger now, if anything, closer as they were, and without a crowd of soldiers and onlookers pressing in around them. "You came," he said, and there was something in his voice, a rawness he did not bother to hide, that told her he had genuinely doubted she would. "I almost didn't," she admitted, because some strange instinct told her that honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, was the right choice with this man. A faint smile touched his mouth. "I'm glad you did, regardless." He gestured toward a stone bench near the fountain, and Alira found herself walking toward it, her earlier fear ebbing slightly in the quiet of the garden, though it did not disappear entirely. She was still acutely aware that she was a herbalist's daughter, sitting in a private courtyard with the most powerful man in the kingdom, and that awareness never quite left her, no matter how gentle his manner, or how quiet the setting. "I imagine you have questions," Cale said once they were both seated, leaving a respectful distance between them on the bench. "I know I certainly do." "What happened in the market?" Alira said slowly, choosing her words with care. "What was that?" "I felt something, when your wolf found me, and again when you looked at me. I don't understand what it means, or why it happened to me specifically." Cale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the fountain, as though gathering his thoughts before he spoke. "Among our kind," he said eventually, "there exists a bond between certain pairs, one that neither party chooses, and neither can fully explain. Scholars call it many things. Some call it fate, some call it simply biology, the body recognizing something the mind has not yet caught up to. Whatever it is called, my wolf recognized it the moment we came close enough in that market square, and so, I confess, did I." "A mate bond," Alira said quietly, the words tasting strange in her mouth, though she had heard them whispered in stories often enough to recognize the shape of them. "Yes," Cale said, "I understand. This is not something you asked for, or expected, and I want to be entirely clear with you, Alira, that I have no intention of forcing anything upon you because of it. A bond is not a chain. It does not obligate you to feel anything you do not genuinely feel, nor does it obligate me to claim anything I have not been freely offered." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had softened further still. "But I would be lying if I told you I did not want to explore what this means, together, if you are willing." Alira looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, and tried to sort through the tangled mess of fear and curiosity and something else entirely, something warmer and far more dangerous than either, that had settled into her chest since the moment their eyes first met across the market square. "I don't know how to trust this," she admitted finally. "Everything I have ever been taught tells me that when someone powerful wants something from someone like me, it rarely ends well for the person with less power." "I understand why you would believe that," Cale said, and there was no defensiveness in his voice, only a quiet, steady patience that surprised her. "I cannot undo every story you have heard, nor erase every fear those stories have given you. All I can offer is time, and the chance to see for yourself whether I mean what I say." He rose from the bench and extended his hand toward her, the same gesture he had offered in the market square, and once again, it was clearly a question rather than a command. "Will you stay, at least for tonight?" and let me show you that this palace need not be the frightening place you imagine it to be." Elira looked up at him, at the sincerity written plainly across his face, at the enormous black wolf she could sense somewhere close by, though he had given them privacy for this conversation, and felt the last of her resistance waver, not vanish entirely, but soften into something closer to cautious hope. "One night," she said finally, placing her hand carefully in his. "I will stay one night, and we will see what happens after that." Cale's fingers closed gently around hers, warm and careful, as though he understood exactly how fragile this fledgling trust remained, and how easily it could shatter if handled without care. "One night," he agreed, "and however many after that you choose to give me." He led her through the garden and into the palace itself, and Elira found that walking beside him, rather than being paraded before him like a prisoner or a prize, made the enormous stone halls feel slightly less overwhelming than she had feared. Servants passed them in the corridors, each one bowing respectfully to Cale before their eyes flicked, with poorly concealed curiosity, toward Elira, taking in her plain traveling dress and simple leather shoes, so different from the silks and jewels she imagined most guests of the palace wore. "They will talk," Cale said quietly, noticing the direction of her gaze. "I won't pretend otherwise. A king's wolf breaking formation in a public market is not the sort of thing that stays quiet for long, and by tomorrow, half the capital will know some version of what happened, likely with several new and entirely invented details added along the way." "That doesn't worry you?" Elira asked, surprised by how calmly he spoke of it. "It worries me for your sake, not my own," he said. "I have spent my whole life under the eyes of others. I am accustomed to it in a way that you are not, and I would rather you understand what you are walking into now, honestly, than discover it later and feel as though I hid it from you." They passed through a set of tall doors into a smaller dining hall, far less grand than Elira had expected, with a modest table set for two, rather than the sprawling banquet hall she had imagined lay somewhere deeper in the palace. A fire crackled in a stone hearth along one wall, and the smell of roasted vegetables and fresh bread drifted from covered dishes already waiting on the table. "I asked for something simple," Cale explained, pulling out a chair for her. "I thought a smaller room, away from the formal halls, might feel less like an interrogation and more like a conversation." Elira allowed herself a small, surprised smile as she took the offered seat. "You put more thought into this than I expected." "I have thought of little else these past 3 days," Cale admitted, taking his own seat across from her. "My advisors would tell you I have been distracted and difficult company at the summit, and they would not be wrong." As they ate, the conversation drifted into gentler territory. Questions about her mother's remedies, about the village where she had grown up, about the small, quiet details of a life so different from his own that he seemed genuinely fascinated by all of it, asking question after question, with an attentiveness that made Elira, despite herself, begin to relax. He told her, in turn, about the weight of ruling a kingdom that had only recently emerged from years of conflict with neighboring pacts, about the endless meetings and treaties and careful diplomacy that filled nearly every hour of his days, and about how rare it was for him to sit and simply talk with someone who wanted nothing from him beyond his company. It was nearing the end of their meal when the doors to the small dining hall opened without warning, and the gray-robed advisor from the market square, Bertrand, stepped inside, his expression carefully neutral, in a way that immediately put Elira on edge. "Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty," Bertrand said, though his tone carried little genuine apology. "A matter has arisen regarding tomorrow's council session. I believed it required your immediate attention." Cale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It could not wait until morning?" "I judged it could not," Bertrand replied smoothly, his eyes flicking briefly, deliberately, toward Elira, before returning to the king, particularly given certain developments the council will wish to discuss. Elira did not miss the pointed weight behind that final word, nor the way Bertrand's gaze lingered on her for just a moment too long, before he excused himself from the room, leaving the door open behind him, in silent expectation that Cale would follow. "I apologize," Cale said, rising from his seat with visible reluctance. "I did not intend for our first evening to be interrupted so soon." "It's all right," Elira said, though the uneasy feeling Bertrand's arrival had stirred in her chest did not entirely fade. "You have a kingdom to run. I understand that comes first." It does not come before you, Kale said firmly, and though Alira wanted to believe him completely, some cautious part of her filed the exchange away carefully, uncertain what it meant for the advisor who clearly did not share his king's enthusiasm for this sudden, unexpected turn of events. I will have someone show you to a guest chamber. Please, rest well tonight, and know that whatever the council discusses, it changes nothing about what I said to you in the garden. Alira nodded, though as she followed a quiet, kindly servant through the winding palace corridors toward her chamber for the night, she could not quite shake the memory of Bertrand's calculating eyes, nor the unspoken warning that had passed briefly between them in that doorway. A warning she was certain, somehow, that she would come to understand far too well in the days ahead. The guest chamber was larger than Alira's entire cottage, and for the first hour after the servant left her alone, she simply stood in the middle of the room, unsure what to do with so much space that belonged, however temporarily, to her alone. Sleep did not come easily. She lay beneath blankets softer than anything she had ever touched, staring up at a ceiling painted with faint gold patterns she could barely make out in the dim candlelight, and her mind kept circling back to Bertrand's face in the doorway, the careful neutrality that had not quite managed to hide his displeasure. She thought too of Kale's insistence that nothing had changed, and wondered how much weight a king's promises truly carried against the objections of the men who advised him. She must have slept eventually, because she woke to sunlight streaming through tall windows, and the sound of a soft knock at her door. A young servant girl entered at her invitation, carrying a tray of bread, fruit, and warm tea, along with a folded note bearing the now familiar wolf crest seal. Alira, I hope you slept well, despite last night's interruption. The council session runs through the morning, but I would very much like to show you the palace grounds this afternoon, if you are willing. Corwin will come for you when I am free. Kale. She spent the morning exploring the guest chamber's adjoining sitting room, running her fingers over books she could not read the titles of, since her mother had only taught her enough letters to label her herb jars, and watching the activity in the courtyard below her window, servants and nobles moving about their business with a brisk efficiency that reminded her, in its own strange way, of the market square back home, just with far finer clothing and far less shouting. Corwin arrived shortly after midday, as promised, and led her through a different set of corridors than the ones from the previous evening, toward a wide set of doors that opened onto grounds far more extensive than Alira had imagined lay hidden behind the palace's outer walls. Gardens stretched in every direction, some formally arranged with clipped hedges and fountains, others left wilder, closer to what she recognized from the forests near her own home, and beyond them, she could see training yards where soldiers moved through drills, and stables housing more horses than her entire village owned collectively. Kale was waiting near a smaller garden path, dressed once again in the simple clothing she had seen the night before, and his face brightened visibly at her approach in a way that made something warm settle low in her chest, despite her lingering caution. I thought we might walk, he said. There is a part of the grounds I would like to show you, somewhere quieter than the formal gardens. They walked together in comfortable silence at first, following a winding path that led gradually away from the palace's more populated areas, until the sounds of soldiers training and servants calling to one another faded into the softer noise of birdsong and rustling leaves. The path eventually opened onto a small clearing, overlooking a stretch of forest that bordered the palace grounds, wild and untamed, compared to the carefully manicured gardens closer to the palace walls. This is where I come when I need to think, Kale said, gesturing toward a stone bench positioned to overlook the tree line. Away from advisors, away from petitions, away from the constant weight of being watched and judged for every decision. It's beautiful, Alira said, and meant it, the wild tangle of trees and undergrowth, reminding her strongly of the hills near her cottage, familiar in a way that eased some of the tension she had carried since arriving at the palace. They sat together on the bench, and for a while neither of them spoke, content simply to watch the wind move through the branches and listen to the distant calls of birds settling into the trees. It was Kale who finally broke the silence, his voice quieter and more hesitant than she had yet heard it. May I ask you something personal? He said. You do not have to answer, if you would rather not. Alira nodded, though her stomach tightened slightly with the familiar anticipation of being asked to explain herself, a feeling she had carried since childhood, ever since she first understood how differently the world treated people like her. Why did you hide? In the market? Kale asked. I don't ask to accuse you of anything, only because I have thought about it often since that day, and I confess, I do not fully understand. Most people, seeing a royal procession, would want to watch, not hide. Alira was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over carefully before she answered. I'm unmated, she said finally. Unregistered, technically, though I've always avoided the registration offices when I could, because I've heard too many stories about what happens to Omegas who catch the wrong kind of attention. My mother taught me, from the time I was very young, that the safest thing an unmated Omega could do around powerful strangers was disappear. Find a wall. Stay small. Never be seen standing alone. Kale's expression shifted as she spoke, something tightening around his eyes that looked almost like pain, though it took Alira a moment to understand that the pain was not directed at her, but at what she was describing. What kind of stories? He asked quietly. Villages losing daughters to passing alphas who decided they wanted something, Alira said, her voice steady despite the uncomfortable weight of the topic. Families paid to stay quiet, or threatened into it when payment wasn't enough. I don't know how many of those stories were entirely true, and how many grew larger with each retelling, but I grew up believing enough of them to make hiding feel like the only sensible choice whenever soldiers or nobility passed through. I am sorry, Kale said, and the raw sincerity in his voice surprised her. Sorry that such things happened, sorry that you grew up needing to fear them, and sorry that when you finally did encounter someone in my position, it was under circumstances that must have felt like every warning you'd ever been given, coming true at once. You didn't do any of that, though, Alira said, surprising herself with how readily the words came. You asked. You gave me the choice to refuse. That's not nothing, Kale. In fact, it's more than I expected, if I'm honest. Something eased in Kale's shoulders at her words, a tension she had not fully noticed until it began to release. I want to be worthy of that trust, he said. Not just because of the bond, though I won't pretend that isn't part of it. I want to earn it, because you deserve someone who treats your choices as though they matter, regardless of what fate or biology decided about the two of us in that market square. They sat together a while longer, the conversation drifting into gentler topics, Kale asking about her mother's remedies with genuine curiosity, Alira asking, in turn, about his own childhood, surprised to learn that beneath the crown and the careful authority he carried so naturally, he had once been simply a boy who preferred the company of the palace stable hands to that of visiting nobility, more comfortable mucking out stalls than sitting through formal dinners. My father believed a king should understand every part of his kingdom, not just the parts that flattered him, Kale said, a faint smile touching his mouth at the memory. He used to send me to work alongside the stable hands, the kitchen staff, even the tanners at the edge of the city, though I confess I did not always appreciate the lesson at the time. And now? Alira asked. Now I understand exactly what he meant, Kale said. A king who only knows his own comfort makes poor decisions for everyone else. The afternoon slipped away faster than either of them seemed to notice, the sun beginning its slow descent by the time they finally rose from the bench and began the walk back toward the palace. It was as they approached the formal gardens once more, the sounds of palace life growing louder around them, that Alira first noticed the group of nobles gathered near one of the fountains, their heads bent together in low conversation that stopped abruptly the moment Kale and Alira came into view. Among them stood a young woman, in fine violet silks, her dark hair elaborately styled, her expression carrying the particular kind of cold assessment that Alira recognized instantly, having occasionally seen similar looks directed at her own worn clothing during less fortunate market days. The woman's eyes moved over Alira slowly, taking in every detail of her simple traveling dress, before flicking toward Kale with an entirely different expression, warmer, more practiced, though something calculating lingered beneath it. Your Majesty, the woman said, dropping into a graceful curtsy. What a pleasant surprise. I did not realize you had returned from your walk. Lady Cassandra, Kale said, and Alira noted the slight formality that entered his voice, a distance that had not been present in their earlier conversation. I did not expect to find you in the gardens this afternoon. I was hoping to speak with you regarding the Eastern trade agreements, when you have a moment to spare, Cassandra said smoothly, though her gaze drifted again toward Alira, lingering just long enough to feel deliberate. though I see you are otherwise occupied at present. This is Elira, Kale said, and Elira felt a flush of self-consciousness at being formally introduced, uncertain what title, if any, applied to her strange new circumstances. She is my guest at the palace. How lovely, Cassandra said, her smile never wavering, though something in her tone suggested the sentiment did not run quite so deep as the words implied. The Market Square incident. Everyone has been talking of little else these past 3 days. It is rare that His Majesty's wolf takes such an interest in anyone. The pointed emphasis on anyone was not lost on Elira, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever she sensed judgment being passed on her worth, without a single word being spoken outright. She said nothing, uncertain of the proper response in a situation so far outside anything she had ever navigated before, and was grateful when Kale spoke instead. I will find time for the trade discussions tomorrow, Lady Cassandra, Kale said, his tone leaving little room for further conversation. For now, I intend to see my guest safely settled before evening. Cassandra's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, though she recovered quickly, dropping into another graceful curtsy before turning back toward her companions, though not before her eyes found Elira's one final time, a look that carried none of the warmth she had shown Kale, and all of the cold calculation Elira had first noticed. She doesn't like me, Elira said quietly, once they had put enough distance between themselves and the fountain that she felt safe speaking freely. Lady Cassandra's family has long hoped for an alliance between our houses, Kale said with a sigh that carried the particular weariness of a subject he had clearly navigated many times before. Her father has proposed the match on several occasions over the years. I have always declined, but I imagine today's events have not improved her opinion of the situation. An alliance, Elira repeated slowly, the political weight of the word settling uncomfortably in her stomach. Because I'm not the kind of match her family would consider suitable. Kale stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression earnest in a way that eased some, though not all, of her rising unease. Elira, listen to me. Whatever political alliances certain families may have hoped for, they were never my choice to give, regardless of who I happened to meet in a market square. My heart does not consult trade agreements before deciding who it recognizes. Elira wanted to believe him completely, and in that moment, standing in the golden afternoon light with his earnest gaze fixed on hers, she nearly did. But as they continued their walk back toward the palace, she could not quite shake the memory of Cassandra's calculating stare, nor the uneasy certainty that not everyone within these walls would be so easily convinced to accept a herbalist's daughter into the king's life, whatever the bond between them might mean. Can I ask you something else? Elira said, as they passed beneath an archway thick with climbing ivy. About the bond itself. You said it isn't something either of us chose. Does that mean it can be broken, if one person decides they want it to be? Kale considered the question carefully before answering, and Elira appreciated that he did not rush to reassure her, but seemed genuinely intent on giving her an honest answer, rather than a comfortable one. The scholars disagree, he said finally. Some argue the bond fades if it is deliberately refused and never acted upon, growing quieter over years until it becomes little more than a faint awareness. Others believe it never fully disappears, regardless of choice, only grows harder to bear the longer it goes unanswered. I do not know which is true, only what I have read, and what little I have observed among others who share it. Have you known others? Elira asked. With a bond like ours? My own parents shared one, Kale said, a softness entering his voice at the mention of them. My mother was not born into nobility either, though her family held more standing than yours does, admittedly. My father used to say finding her was the only truly effortless decision he made in his entire reign. Everything else required negotiation, compromise, endless deliberation. Not her, not once he knew what she was to him. What happened to them? Elira asked gently, sensing from his tone that the story did not end simply. A fever took my mother when I was 12, Kale said. My father never remarried, though the council pressed him constantly to secure a political alliance through a second marriage. He said he would rather rule alone than pretend a contract could replace what he had lost. I did not fully understand that choice until recently, if I am honest with you. Elira absorbed this quietly, understanding suddenly why the pressure from families like Cassandra's must weigh on him so heavily. caught between a council that valued alliances above all else, and a father's example that suggested some bonds simply could not, and should not, be replaced by careful political arrangement. Before they reached the main courtyard, a low shape emerged from between two hedges, and Alira's breath caught as Kale's enormous black wolf padded toward them, his golden eyes settling immediately on her, with the same unmistakable warmth she remembered from the market square. "He's been waiting for you all afternoon," Kale said, a note of amusement in his voice. "He rarely leaves my side for long, but today he insisted on patrolling the eastern gardens instead, near the path we walked." "May I?" Alira asked, glancing at Kale uncertainly, one hand half raised toward the wolf, who had settled onto his haunches a respectful distance away, watching her with patient anticipation. "He would be disappointed if you didn't," Kale said, and something in his tone suggested this was not simply a polite reassurance, but a genuine truth about the creature standing before her. Alira stepped closer, slowly, and reached out to rest her palm against the thick black fur of his shoulder. Up close, she could feel the steady thrum of a heartbeat beneath her hand, powerful and strong, and the wolf leaned into her touch with a low, contented sound that made something in her own chest loosen further still. "Does he have a name?" she asked. "Separate from yours, I mean." "I've always wondered whether the wolf half thinks of itself differently." "He does, though it isn't something most people ask," Kale said, looking faintly surprised and pleased by the question. "Fenris. My mother chose it when I was young, before I had learned to shift on my own. She said every part of a person deserves to be known by its own name, not simply folded into the other." "Fenris," Alira repeated softly, and the wolf's ears flicked toward her at the sound, his tail sweeping once against the grass in an unmistakable gesture of pleasure. "I like that, it suits him." "He likes you," Kale said, watching the exchange with an expression Alira could not quite name, though it carried a tenderness that made her feel suddenly and acutely aware of how close they were standing. "Which is not entirely surprising given the bond, but I confess it still catches me off guard each time I see it. Fenris has never shown this kind of ease around anyone outside my own family, not in 5 years." They lingered in the courtyard a while longer, Fenris eventually settling at their feet as they resumed a quieter conversation, this one drifting toward lighter subjects, Kale describing, with visible fondness, some of the more chaotic incidents from his boyhood among the stable hands, and Alira offering, in turn, small stories from her own childhood, tales of her mother teaching her which roots eased fever, and which flowers, if handled carelessly, could do far worse than heal. It struck her, as the light faded gradually toward evening, how easily the conversation flowed between them now, how little effort it took to simply exist in his company, a realization that both comforted and unsettled her in equal measure. It was nearly dusk when a servant approached to inform them that dinner had been prepared, and as they made their way back toward the palace, Alira noticed, near one of the side entrances, a cluster of guards speaking in low, urgent tones, with an unfamiliar man, dressed in travel-worn clothing, mud still clinging to his boots, as though he had ridden hard and far to reach the palace. Kale's expression sharpened the moment he spotted the exchange, and he excused himself briefly to speak with the guards, leaving Alira standing a short distance away, with Fenris pressed protectively against her side. She could not hear the full conversation, but she caught fragments carried on the evening breeze, words like border patrol and unusual movement, and more troublingly, House Ashgrove, a name she did not recognize, but which seemed to draw an immediate tightening around Kale's jaw. When he returned to her side a few minutes later, his earlier ease had given way to something more guarded, though he made a visible effort to soften his expression before speaking. "Is everything all right?" Alira asked. "A minor matter along the border," Kale said, though his tone carried a careful weight that suggested it was not so minor as his words implied. "Nothing that concerns you directly. I apologize, but I may need to attend a brief meeting after dinner." Alira nodded, though the mention of House Ashgrove lingered uneasily in her mind, joining the growing collection of small warnings she had gathered since arriving at the palace. Bertrand's calculating neutrality, Cassandra's cold assessment, and now this. A border matter urgent enough to darken Kale's expression so quickly after an afternoon of easy warmth. That evening, after another quiet dinner shared with Kale, this time uninterrupted by advisors or unexpected counsels, Alira retired to her guest chamber, with her mind still turning over the day's events. She thought of Bertrand's careful neutrality, of Cassandra's cold assessment, of the whispered conversations that had stopped the moment she and Cale came into view near the fountain, and of the mud-stained messenger whose news had shadowed Cale's face so quickly. She understood, with a clarity that settled heavily in her chest, that whatever this bond between them meant, it would not exist in a vacuum. There were people within these palace walls, and perhaps beyond them, who had their own plans for Cale's future, plans that did not include a herbalist's daughter from the eastern hills, and Alira suspected, as she finally drifted toward sleep, that she had not yet begun to understand just how far some of them might go to see those plans realized. She woke sometime past midnight to the sound of raised voices, carrying faintly from somewhere deeper in the palace, too distant and muffled to make out clear words, but urgent enough in their tone that sleep refused to return easily afterward. She rose quietly and moved to the tall window overlooking the courtyard, drawing the curtain back just enough to see two figures standing beneath a lantern near the stables, their shapes made small by distance. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, moved with the same restless energy she had already come to recognize as Cale's, pacing, while the other, shorter and stiller, stood with arms folded in a posture of quiet insistence that reminded her unmistakably of Bertrand. She could not hear their words, only the rise and fall of their voices, but something about the exchange, the sharp gestures, the way Cale finally stopped pacing and stood rigid, arms crossed, jaw set, told her this was not a simple discussion of border patrols and trade schedules. She stayed at the window long after the two figures parted ways, Bertrand disappearing back into the palace, Cale remaining alone beneath the lantern for several long minutes, his head bowed, one hand pressed against the back of his neck, in a gesture of weariness she had not yet seen from him. Eventually he too turned and made his way back inside, and Alira let the curtain fall closed, climbing back into the enormous, unfamiliar bed, with her mind spinning through possibilities she could not confirm, and did not yet have the standing to ask about directly. She lay in the darkness for a long while, listening to the fading echoes of the argument, and found herself wondering, with a growing unease she could not quite shake, whether the quiet, gentle world Cale had shown her that afternoon was the true shape of palace life, or merely the calm surface stretched thin over currents far more dangerous than she had yet allowed herself to imagine. The council chamber doors were closed when Alira passed them the next morning, but the voices behind them were not quiet enough to stay hidden entirely, and she froze in the corridor when she caught her own name spoken sharply, followed by a chorus of murmured agreement from what sounded like several people at once. She should have kept walking. She knew this even as her feet remained rooted to the polished stone floor, every instinct telling her that eavesdropping on the king's counsel was neither wise nor likely to bring her any comfort. But her name had been spoken with such clear disapproval that curiosity overpowered caution, and she edged closer to the heavy wooden doors, straining to make out the words beyond them. An unregistered Omega, with no family standing, no political connections, nothing to offer the crown, beyond whatever fleeting instinct drew the wolf to her. Bertrand's voice carried clearly through the gap beneath the door, cold and precise. Your Majesty, I understand the significance of a mate bond, truly I do, but you cannot allow personal feeling to override decades of careful diplomatic positioning. The Eastern Trade Alliance with House Ashgrove has been in negotiation for 3 years, came another voice, older, gravelly, one Alira did not recognize. Lord Ashgrove has made his expectations regarding Lady Cassandra's marriage prospects quite clear. If your Majesty is seen favoring an unknown herbalist over that arrangement, we risk unraveling everything the treaty was meant to secure. The border incursions grow more frequent, Bertrand added, his voice sharpening further. House Ashgrove's cooperation is not a courtesy, Your Majesty. It is a necessity, and Lord Ashgrove will not remain patient indefinitely if he believes his daughter has been publicly humiliated in favor of a common village girl. Alira's chest tightened painfully at the words, common village girl, spoken with such casual dismissal that it landed harder than any insult she had faced in the market square. She had known, in some abstract way, that her presence at the palace complicated matters far beyond her own small concerns, but hearing it laid out so plainly, weighed against treaties and border security and the delicate politics of an entire kingdom, made the full scope of what she had stumbled into finally settle over her with crushing weight. I will not discuss Illyra as though she were a line item in a trade negotiation. Kale's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp enough that Illyra flinched slightly even through the closed door. The bond is not something I can simply set aside because it proves politically inconvenient. With respect, Your Majesty, Bertrand pressed, undeterred. A bond can be resisted. History provides examples of rulers who chose duty over instinct when circumstances demanded it. Your own father. Do not, Kale said, and his voice had gone dangerously quiet now, quiet in a way that silenced the room instantly. Do not invoke my father in this conversation, Bertrand. You did not know him well enough to speak for what he would have wanted. A tense silence followed, and Illyra, still frozen in the corridor, became suddenly, acutely aware that she should not be standing there any longer, that continuing to listen risked her being discovered in a position that would only add fuel to whatever concerns Bertrand and the council already harbored about her judgment and her place within these walls. She turned and walked quickly back the way she had come, her thoughts churning with everything she had overheard, common village girl, and personal feeling, and decades of careful diplomatic positioning circling through her mind, in an unrelenting loop. She did not see Kale again until early afternoon, when he found her in the small garden courtyard where they had first spoken, sitting on the same stone bench with her hands folded tightly in her lap. He looked tired in a way she had not seen before, faint shadows beneath his eyes, his shoulders carrying a tension that had not been there the previous day. I'm told the council session ran long, Illyra said carefully, choosing not to reveal what she had overheard, though something in her expression must have given her away, because Kale's face immediately softened with concern. You heard, he said. It was not a question. Illyra considered denying it, but the careful trust they had built over the past 2 days felt too fragile, too new, to risk damaging with a lie. Some of it, she admitted. Enough to understand that my being here creates difficulties for you that go far beyond anything I imagined when I agreed to come. Kale sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. I won't insult you by pretending the council's concerns are baseless, he said finally. The Eastern Trade Alliance matters a great deal to this kingdom's security, and Lord Ashgrove is not a man who forgives perceived slights easily. Bertrand is not wrong that my choices carry consequences beyond my own happiness. Illyra felt something cold settle in her stomach at his words, a familiar fear rising to meet it, the same fear that had sent her ducking behind a market stall 3 days earlier, the certainty that she did not belong in spaces meant for people with power and standing, that her presence here was, at best, a temporary indulgence that would eventually be corrected in favor of more sensible arrangements. Then perhaps I should return home, she said quietly, the words costing her more than she expected them to, before this becomes a larger problem than it already is. No, Kale said immediately, turning to face her fully, his expression suddenly urgent. Illyra, listen to me. I am not saying this to suggest I intend to send you away, or that Bertrand's concerns will change my mind about what I want. I am saying it because I want you to understand exactly what you are walking into, honestly, rather than discovering the difficulty of it gradually, and feeling as though I concealed it from you. That's a fine distinction, Illyra said, though some of the sharpness in her voice came from fear rather than genuine anger. Knowing the danger doesn't make it less dangerous. No, Kale agreed. It doesn't. But it does mean you can choose to face it with clear eyes, rather than being blindsided later by threats you never saw coming. He reached for her hand, and she allowed him to take it, though her fingers remained tense within his grip. I meant what I told you in this same garden 2 days ago. I do not intend to let political convenience decide my future, or yours, but I would be lying if I claimed there was no risk in that choice, for either of us. What kind of risk? Illyra asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer would only deepen the unease that had settled over her since overhearing the council's discussion. Kale hesitated, and in that hesitation, Illyra read more than she suspected he intended to reveal. House Ashgrove is proud, he said finally. And Lord Ashgrove has never responded well to feeling slighted. I do not believe he would act rashly against the crown directly, but I would not put it past him to seek other ways of expressing his displeasure, ways that might not target me at all. The implication settled over Illyra with cold clarity. You mean he might target me instead? I mean, I intend to ensure that does not happen, Kale said firmly. though the promise did little to fully ease the knot forming in her chest. I have already spoken with my personal guard about increasing precautions, quietly, without drawing further attention to the matter. You will not be left unprotected, Illyra. I give you my word on that. Illyra wanted to trust the certainty in his voice, and mostly, she found that she did. The steady conviction in his eyes, carrying more weight than any formal promise could have offered. But the fear that had followed her through most of her life, the careful instinct that had taught her to disappear rather than be seen, did not simply vanish because a king held her hand and spoke reassuring words in a quiet garden. It settled instead into a watchful corner of her mind, quiet but persistent, a reminder that whatever warmth she found within these walls, danger had already begun circling at the edges of it, waiting for the moment it might close in. I'm not asking you to choose between me and your kingdom, she said finally, meeting his eyes directly. I don't want that weight on either of us, but I need you to understand that if things become dangerous, truly dangerous, I won't simply stay quiet and hope it resolves itself. I've spent my whole life being careful. I don't intend to stop now, even here. I would expect nothing less, Kale said, and something in his expression, admiration mixed with the same protective urgency she had seen in Fenris's golden eyes back in the market square, told her he meant it completely. Whatever comes, Illyra, you will not face it alone. That much, I promise you absolutely. They remained in the garden a while longer, the earlier tension gradually easing into something quieter. Though it did not disappear entirely, a thread of unease now woven permanently into the fabric of Illyra's growing feelings for this man, and the strange, dangerous world he had drawn her into. Later that afternoon, while Kale was called away to finish the postponed trade discussions, Illyra found herself wandering the palace library, a room so vast and quiet that her footsteps echoed faintly against the high stone ceiling. She had never seen so many books gathered in one place, shelves stretching upward further than she could comfortably crane her neck to follow, and though she could read only simply, she found herself drawn to a table near the window, where an elderly woman sat surrounded by scrolls, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a soft cap. You must be the young woman everyone has been whispering about, the woman said without looking up from her work, though her tone carried curiosity rather than judgment. Come, sit. You look as though you could use a quiet corner away from prying eyes. Illyra hesitated, then accepted the offer, lowering herself into the chair across from the woman, who introduced herself as Morella, the palace's keeper of records and, as it turned out, one of the few scholars who had spent decades studying the old accounts of mate bonds among the ruling houses. I understand you have questions, Morella said, setting aside her scroll, and studying Illyra, with sharp, assessing eyes, that nonetheless held none of the coldness Illyra had grown used to, from Bertrand or Cassandra. Most who find themselves suddenly bonded to someone of significant standing do. Is it always this complicated? Illyra asked, the question slipping out before she had fully decided to voice it. The politics, I mean. The council, the alliances, all of it. Morella's expression softened into something almost sympathetic. Power rarely simplifies matters of the heart, child. If anything, it tangles them further. I have read accounts stretching back 3 centuries of bonded pairs, who faced exactly what you and His Majesty now face, some who weathered it, and built lasting happiness despite the obstacles, others who did not survive the pressure intact. She paused, studying Illyra carefully. I tell you this, not to frighten you, but because I suspect you would rather know the truth than be comforted by pleasant lies. I would, Illyra said firmly, grateful, despite the unsettling nature of the answer, for someone willing to speak plainly with her, rather than softening every difficult truth, the way she sometimes felt Kale, in his eagerness to reassure her, might be tempted to do. The bond itself is not your enemy, Morella continued, tapping one weathered finger against the scroll before her. It is simply a fact, as undeniable as the color of your eyes. What determines whether it flourishes or withers is not fate, but the choices made by those who carry it, and by those around them who either support or undermine it. House Ashgrove will not be your friend in this. I suspect you already understand that much. But you are not without allies here either, whatever Lord Bertrand's council chamber grumbling might suggest. You've heard about the council session, Illyra said, not entirely surprised, given how quickly gossip seemed to travel within these walls. Everyone has heard, child, Morella said with a faint, wry smile, Palace walls carry sound and rumor in equal measure, and rarely distinguish carefully between the two. But I would caution you against placing too much weight on Bertrand's opinions. He has served 3 generations of this royal house, and his loyalty to the throne's stability runs deep, sometimes deeper than his loyalty to the king's own happiness. That does not make him your enemy, precisely. Only a man who fears change more than he fears causing you pain. Illyra turned this over carefully, finding some small comfort in the reframing, though it did little to erase the sting of common village girl, still echoing faintly in her memory. And Lady Cassandra? She asked. Is she simply afraid of change as well, or something else? Morella's expression grew more careful at the question, a flicker of something Illyra could not quite name passing behind her sharp eyes. Lady Cassandra has wanted this match for a long time, longer than most within the palace realize. I would advise caution there, child, more than with Bertrand. Ambition wounded is far more dangerous than tradition, merely inconvenienced. The warning settled uneasily into Illyra's chest, joining the collection of small fears she had gathered since arriving, and she thanked Morella for her honesty, before making her way back through the winding corridors toward her guest chamber, the vast library fading behind her, though its warnings did not fade nearly so easily. As the afternoon light shifted toward evening, she found herself watching the palace walls with new eyes, no longer simply a place of unfamiliar grandeur, but a place holding secrets and rivalries, and ambitions that stretched far beyond anything she had understood when she first stepped through its gates, and she wondered, with a growing sense of foreboding she could not quite shake, just how soon those hidden currents would rise to the surface, and what they might cost her when they finally did. The letter arrived hidden inside a basket of freshly cut flowers, and Illyra nearly missed it entirely, tucked beneath the stems where an ordinary gift would never have concealed anything at all. It had been 6 days since her arrival at the palace, 6 days that had settled into a rhythm she found herself, despite every early caution, growing genuinely fond of, mornings spent with Morella in the library learning small pieces of history and lore, afternoons walking the grounds with Cale and Fenris, evenings shared over quiet dinners that no longer required careful navigation of unfamiliar customs, only comfortable conversation between 2 people learning each other's edges. Cale had arranged for a small chamber near the eastern garden to be set aside for her herbal work, and she had begun, slowly, to feel less like a guest passing through, and more like someone who might, impossibly, actually belong within these walls. The flowers arrived that morning without explanation, delivered by a servant girl Illyra did not recognize, who set the basket on her table with a quick curtsy, and left before Illyra could ask who had sent them. She assumed, at first, that they came from Cale, a small gesture in keeping with the gentle attentiveness he had shown her since her arrival, and it was only as she lifted the arrangement to find a proper vase that her fingers brushed against a folded scrap of parchment tucked deep among the stems. She unfolded it carefully, and the warmth she had been feeling only moments before drained away entirely as she read the message written in a cramped, unfamiliar hand. Girls who reach above their station rarely land softly. Return to your village before the fall becomes permanent. There was no signature, no seal, nothing to identify who had sent it, only the flowers themselves, ordinary and lovely, and now suddenly sinister, in a way that made Illyra's hands begin to tremble as she stared at the words. She read the note 3 more times, as though repetition might somehow soften its meaning, or reveal it to be a misunderstanding, rather than the clear threat it plainly was. She thought immediately of Morella's warning, ambition wounded is far more dangerous than tradition merely inconvenienced, and of Cassandra's cold, assessing eyes at the fountain, though she had no proof, nothing beyond instinct, to connect the note to any particular hand. She thought too of Bertrand's careful neutrality, and of the countless nobles who had likely heard, by now, every detail of the Market Square incident, any number of whom might resent a common herbalist's daughter drawing the attention that had for years been reserved for carefully calculated political matches. Her first instinct was to hide the note entirely, to fold it small and tuck it away where no one would find it, the same instinct that had sent her ducking behind a market stall barely a week earlier. But she thought of what she had told Cale in the garden, that she would not simply stay quiet and hope danger resolved itself, and she forced herself, hands still shaking, to seek him out rather than retreat into silence. She found him in a smaller study adjoining the council chamber, bent over a scattering of maps and correspondence, and the moment he looked up and saw her face, his own expression shifted instantly from mild surprise to sharp concern. "Elira, what's happened?" She crossed the room and set the note on the desk before him without speaking, unable to trust her voice just yet, and watched his face as he read it. Watched the warmth drain from his features and something colder, harder, take its place. "Where did this come from?" he asked, his voice tightly controlled, in a way that told her he was working hard to keep it that way. "Flowers," Elira said, "delivered this morning, by a servant I didn't recognize." The note was hidden among the stems. Cale rose immediately and crossed to the door, calling for Corwin, who appeared within moments, and the quiet urgency with which Cale relayed the details, the description of the servant girl, the need to trace who had ordered the flowers and from where, told Elira clearly that whatever calm reassurance he had offered her in the garden days earlier, this development troubled him far more deeply than he was willing to show on his face for her benefit. "I want the palace kitchens and the flower merchants in the lower market questioned by evening," Cale said, discreetly. "I do not want this spreading through the household as gossip before we understand who is responsible." Corwin nodded and departed swiftly, and once the door had closed behind him, Cale turned back to Elira, his controlled composure slipping just enough to reveal the genuine fear beneath it. "I told you I would ensure your safety, and within a week, someone has already found a way to threaten you inside my own palace walls." "It isn't your fault," Elira said, though the tremor in her voice undercut the reassurance she was trying to offer. "You couldn't have known someone would do this." "I suspected it," Cale admitted grimly, "which is precisely why I should have taken stronger precautions from the start, rather than trusting that quiet vigilance would be enough." He crossed the room and took her hands in his, and this time, Elira did not resist the contact, grateful for the steady warmth of his grip against the cold fear still coiled in her chest. "I am doubling your guard immediately. No one enters your chamber without my personal approval, and you will not walk the grounds unaccompanied until we understand who sent this and what they intend." Elira nodded, though a part of her, the part that had spent her whole life valuing independence and quiet self-sufficiency, chafed slightly against the sudden restriction, even as she understood its necessity. "What if it's simply meant to frighten me away?" she asked. "What if there's no real intention behind it, beyond driving me back to my village?" "Then it has failed already," Cale said firmly, "because I do not intend to let you go anywhere you do not wish to go, regardless of what threats arrive hidden among flower stems. But I would rather assume the worst and be wrong, than assume the best and be caught unprepared." The investigation that followed occupied the remainder of the day, and by evening, Corwin returned with what little information he had managed to gather. The flowers had been purchased from a merchant in the lower market by a servant matching Elira's description of the girl who delivered them, but the merchant claimed not to recognize her as one of the palace's regular staff, and a thorough search of the household records turned up no servant matching her description among the palace's official employ. "Someone hired an outsider to deliver it," Cale said grimly, once Corwin had finished his report. "Which means, whoever sent this note took considerable care to avoid being traced back to anyone within these walls." "That suggests planning," Morella observed quietly. She had joined them in the study once word of the threat reached her, her earlier warm curiosity replaced now by a sharp, focused concern that reminded Elira, uncomfortably, of just how seriously the old scholar had taken her earlier caution about Cassandra's ambition. A hasty threat, born of simple jealousy, would not think to disguise its origins so carefully. This was considered, in advance, by someone accustomed to protecting themselves from consequence. Cale's jaw tightened at the observation, and Elira watched him glance briefly, involuntarily, toward the door, as though picturing the fountain where Cassandra had stood days earlier, cold assessment barely hidden behind practiced courtesy. "I cannot accuse without proof," he said finally, more to himself than to the room at large. "Not Cassandra, not Lord Ashgrove's household, not anyone, without evidence stronger than instinct and unfortunate timing." "No," Morella agreed. "But you can watch more carefully, and you can ensure Elira is never left in a position where instinct alone must serve as her only protection." That evening, Elira found herself unable to settle into sleep, despite the exhausting weight of the day's events, the words of the note circling endlessly through her thoughts. Girls who reach above their station rarely land softly. She rose from her bed and moved to the window, drawing back the curtain to look out over the darkened courtyard. and found, to her surprise, Fenris seated below on the stone path directly beneath her window, his golden eyes turned upward, as though he had sensed her restlessness, even through the thick palace walls. She dressed quickly and made her way down through the quiet corridors, guards nodding respectfully as she passed, clearly having been informed already of the increased vigilance surrounding her movements, until she reached the courtyard and settled onto the cool stone beside the great wolf, who leaned his massive weight gently against her side. "I don't know what I'm doing here," she admitted quietly, resting her hand against his thick fur. "Any of it. A week ago, I was selling dried mint at a market stall, and now someone hates me enough to threaten me over flowers I never asked for." Fenris made a low, rumbling sound in his chest, not quite a growl, something gentler, and pressed his head against her shoulder in a gesture that felt, despite everything, remarkably comforting. "He trusts you completely, you know." Kale's voice came softly from the courtyard entrance, and Alira looked up to find him watching them both, with an expression that mixed exhaustion and tenderness in equal measure. "Fenris has never settled so easily around anyone, myself included, in moments of real danger. He grows guarded, watchful, even with me, not with you. Maybe he simply doesn't understand how much danger I'm actually in," Alira said, though there was no real bitterness in the words, only a tired kind of honesty. Kale crossed the courtyard and settled onto the stone beside her, Fenris shifting to accommodate him without breaking contact with Alira entirely, so that she found herself seated between the king and his wolf, warmth pressing against her from both sides despite the cold night air. "I don't believe that," Kale said quietly. "I think he understands exactly what you mean to us both, and chooses, regardless of the danger, to stay close rather than retreat from it." Alira turned to look at him, at the tired lines around his eyes, at the genuine fear he had not quite managed to fully hide since reading the note that morning, and felt something in her chest settle, not into certainty exactly, but into a quiet resolve that had not been there before. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Whoever sent that note, whatever they hope to accomplish by frightening me, I won't give them the satisfaction of succeeding." A faint, proud smile touched Kale's mouth, though worry still lingered plainly behind it. "I did not expect you to leave," he said. "Though I confess, some small part of me feared it regardless, the moment I read those words." "I've spent my whole life being careful," Alira said, echoing the words she had spoken to him days earlier in this same garden, though they carried new weight now, tested against an actual threat, rather than simply an abstract fear. "Careful enough to hide behind a market stall rather than risk being seen. I don't think careful serves me anymore. Not here. Not with you. I would rather face whatever comes directly than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been, if I'd only been brave enough to stay." Kale reached for her hand in the darkness, and this time, when their fingers intertwined, Alira felt none of the earlier hesitation that had marked their first tentative moments of trust. Whatever danger lingered beyond these palace walls, whoever had sent that cold, threatening note hidden among flowers, meant to look like kindness, she understood now, with a clarity that steadied her more than any promise of guards or precautions could, that she had already made her choice. She would not run. The following morning, Kale called a small private meeting in his study, inviting only Corwin, Morella, and, somewhat to Alira's surprise, Bertrand himself. She had expected the old advisor to view the previous day's events as further evidence that she brought nothing but trouble to the palace, and she braced herself as he entered the room, his gray robes immaculate as always, his expression unreadable. "Your Majesty," Bertrand said, inclining his head toward Kale, before his gaze settled briefly on Alira, something in his expression shifting in a way she could not quite categorize. "I understand there was an incident yesterday." "A threat," Kale said flatly, "delivered into the palace itself, disguised as a gift. I intend to find whoever is responsible, Bertrand, and I expect your full cooperation in that effort, regardless of whatever reservations you continue to hold about Alira's presence here." Bertrand was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the cold formality Alira had grown accustomed to from him. "Your Majesty, whatever concerns I have raised regarding the political complications of this bond, I have never wished harm upon this young woman, nor would I condone such methods being used against her, regardless of who might benefit politically from her departure." He turned to face Alira directly, and something in his weathered face softened, just slightly. I have served this crown for 3 generations, my lady. I have watched good men make decisions that cost this kingdom dearly, and I have watched others sacrifice their own happiness for duty, in ways that, in hindsight, served no one well. My objections were never personal toward you. I only feared the consequences your presence might invite. It seems those consequences have arrived regardless of my caution, and I will not stand by, while someone within these walls resorts to threats against a guest of the crown. Elira absorbed this, surprised by the sincerity in his voice, and found herself reassessing, cautiously, the assumptions she had made about the old advisor since first seeing his calculating gaze in the market square. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I didn't expect that from you, if I'm honest." "Few do," Bertrand said, something almost like a wry smile touching the corner of his mouth. "I have built a reputation for coldness over many years, largely because it serves the crown's interests to have someone in the room willing to voice uncomfortable truths that others would rather avoid. That does not mean I lack conscience, my lady, only that I rarely display it where it might be mistaken for weakness." Cale, watching this exchange with visible relief, redirected the conversation toward more practical matters. "I want the flower merchant questioned again, more thoroughly this time. Someone paid that girl to deliver the note, and someone taught her how to avoid recognition by palace staff. That level of care did not come cheaply, which means whoever arranged it has resources most common conspirators would not. I will handle the merchant personally," Corwin offered, "and I will have the guards review who among the household staff has left the palace grounds in recent days, in case the messenger was hired through an intermediary already known to us. I will review the household ledgers," Bertrand added. "Unusual expenditures, particularly any drawn from accounts belonging to visiting nobility, rather than the palace's own treasury, might reveal who financed this." Mirella, who had remained quiet throughout most of the exchange, finally spoke, her sharp eyes fixed thoughtfully on some middle distance. "I would also examine the timing," she said. "This threat arrived precisely 1 day after Lady Cassandra's encounter with Elira near the fountain, and 2 days after the council session where her family's interests were discussed at length. That timing may be coincidence, but I have found, in my years studying this palace's history, that coincidence rarely explains as much as careful observers assume it does." Cale's expression darkened further at the observation, though he said nothing to confirm or deny the implication, only nodded slowly, filing the thought away alongside the growing collection of evidence, circumstantial though it remained, pointing toward a conclusion none of them wished to state outright without proof. The meeting continued for the better part of an hour, plans forming and reforming as each person offered their piece of the puzzle, until finally Cale dismissed the group with clear instructions to report back the moment any new information surfaced. As the others filed out, Bertrand lingered a moment longer, and to Elira's continued surprise, he approached her directly before leaving. "My lady," he said, his voice quieter now, without the audience of the full room to perform for. "I know my earlier words in the council chamber were harsh, and I do not regret voicing my concerns, as I believe it is my duty to speak plainly, regardless of comfort. But I want you to understand that I bear you no ill will personally, and I will do everything within my power to see this threat resolved swiftly and safely." "I appreciate that," Elira said, meaning it more than she had expected to, "more than you probably realize." Bertrand inclined his head once more and departed, leaving Elira alone with Cale, in the now quiet study, the morning light slanting through tall windows across scattered papers and half-finished plans. "He surprised me," Elira admitted, once the door had closed behind the old advisor. "He surprised me as well," Cale said, though a faint, tired smile touched his mouth. "Bertrand has always been difficult to read, even for those of us who have known him for years. I suspect beneath that careful neutrality, he has simply been waiting to see whether you were someone worth defending, rather than someone who might crumble at the first sign of real difficulty." "And now?" Elira asked. "Now, I think, he has his answer," Cale said, reaching for her hand across the desk. "As do I." Despite the small comfort of Bertrand's unexpected support, the day passed slowly, tension threading through every quiet moment, as Elira waited for news from the ongoing investigation, and found herself, more than once, glancing toward doorways and windows with a wariness that had not fully existed before the threatening note arrived, hidden among its false gift of flowers. It was a feeling she recognized uncomfortably well, the same watchfulness that had governed most of her life before the market square, before Fenris found her hiding behind crates of grain, before a king's golden eyes had looked at her as though she mattered. She had told Kale, and told herself, that she would not run from this danger the way she had once run from simple visibility. But as evening fell, and the palace settled into its familiar rhythm of lantern light and quiet footsteps, Illyra understood that choosing to stay did not mean the fear disappeared entirely. Later that night, unable to settle, she made her way to the small chamber Kale had set aside for her herbal work, finding comfort in the familiar routine of sorting dried leaves and grinding roots, the simple, practical motions of her mother's trade offering a steadiness that nothing else in the palace quite managed to provide. Corwin, assigned now to watch over her more closely, waited quietly near the door, close enough to respond swiftly should anything happen, far enough to grant her the illusion of solitude she badly needed. "You don't have to stand guard so formally," Illyra said eventually, glancing up from the mortar and pestle in her hands. "You could sit, at least. I promise I won't vanish while your back is turned." Corwin's mouth twitched with the ghost of a smile, and he accepted the offer, settling onto a stool near the window, though his eyes never fully left the door. "His Majesty would have my position if anything happened to you under my watch, my lady. Forgive me if old habits of caution die slowly." "Do you think it was Cassandra?" Illyra asked quietly, the question she had been turning over all day finally slipping free. "Truly?" Corwin considered the question with more seriousness than Illyra expected. "I think," he said carefully, "that Lady Cassandra has wanted this match for a long time, and wanting something for a long time can make a person do things they might never have considered in calmer circumstances. But I have also served this palace long enough to know that assumption without proof has ruined more than one innocent reputation, and I would rather see the truth uncovered properly than see blame assigned simply because it fits the shape we expect." Illyra nodded slowly, grinding the dried root in her hands into a fine, familiar powder, the motion steadying the last of her scattered nerves. "That's fair," she admitted. "I suppose I want it to be simple. An answer. A villain. Someone to blame so the fear has somewhere to go. But I imagine it's rarely that simple, is it?" "Rarely," Corwin agreed quietly. "Though I promise you, my lady, simple or not, we will find who is responsible. His Majesty will not rest easily until we do, and neither, I suspect, will the rest of us who have come to care what happens to you these past several days." The quiet kindness in his words caught Illyra off guard, a reminder that whatever danger circled beyond the palace's careful walls, she was no longer facing any of it entirely alone. And as she finished her work, and finally allowed herself to be escorted back toward her chamber for the night, she carried that small comfort with her into an uneasy sleep, alongside the lingering, unshakable certainty that the true danger still lay somewhere ahead, patient and unseen, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. The attack came on a night when the moon hung thin and pale over the palace grounds, 3 days after the threatening note had arrived hidden among its bouquet of false kindness, and Illyra would later remember, with strange clarity, that she had felt unusually calm that evening, lulled into a false sense of security by 3 uneventful days that had allowed her guard to lower just enough for danger to slip through the gap it left behind. She had gone to bed early, tired from a long day spent helping Morella catalog an old collection of herbal texts in the library, and had fallen asleep quickly, despite the extra guards now posted outside her door, their presence having become, over the past days, a comfort rather than a source of unease. She woke sometime past midnight to a soft, deliberate sound at her window, too careful and too quiet to be the wind, and lay perfectly still in the darkness, every sense suddenly sharp with alarm. The sound came again, a faint scrape of metal against wood, and Illyra's heart began to pound as she realized, with dawning horror, that someone was attempting to force open the latch of her window from outside, 3 stories above the ground, which meant whoever attempted it had either scaled the palace wall directly or approached from some hidden ledge she had never noticed during her daytime walks through the gardens below. She did not scream immediately. Some instinct, honed through a lifetime of careful self-preservation, told her that screaming too soon might simply hasten whatever the intruder intended, and instead, she slid silently from her bed, moving on bare feet toward the door where her guards waited just beyond, her hand outstretched to reach the handle, even as the window latch finally gave way, with a soft click behind her. She never made it to the door. A gloved hand closed over her mouth before she had covered half the distance, and she was hauled backward against a broad, unfamiliar chest, her cry of alarm smothered before it could fully form. She fought instinctively, driving her elbow backward into whatever solid mass held her, twisting and kicking with a desperation that surprised even herself, years of quiet caution giving way in an instant to raw, animal need to survive whatever this was. Quiet, a low voice hissed against her ear, rough and unfamiliar. This does not need to hurt, if you simply cooperate. Illyra did not cooperate. She bit down hard against the gloved fingers pressed over her mouth, tasting leather and copper, and felt a savage satisfaction as her captor cursed and momentarily loosened his grip, just enough for her to twist free and stumble toward the door, her voice finally tearing loose, in a scream that echoed through the quiet chamber and, she prayed desperately, through the corridor beyond it as well. The door burst open before her captor could recover his grip, and the guards stationed outside surged into the room, swords already drawn, shouting alarm that would soon carry through the entire wing of the palace. Illyra caught only a brief glimpse of her attacker, a broad-shouldered man dressed entirely in dark clothing, his face obscured by a cloth mask, before he abandoned whatever plan had brought him through her window and dove back toward the opening he had forced, disappearing into the darkness beyond with a speed that suggested considerable practice in exactly this kind of escape. "After him," one of the guards shouted, and two of them scrambled toward the window, while the third crossed quickly to Illyra, who had sunk to the floor, her whole body trembling violently with the sudden release of adrenaline that had carried her through the encounter itself. "My lady, are you injured?" the guard asked urgently, crouching beside her. Illyra shook her head, though her voice, when she finally found it, came out barely above a whisper. "He came through the window, 3 stories up." "How?" She did not finish the question, because at that moment, the corridor outside erupted into new commotion, and Cale appeared in the doorway, still dressed in the loose clothing he wore for sleep, his hair disheveled, his expression carrying a wild, frantic edge Illyra had never seen from him before. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and dropped to his knees beside her, his hands moving over her arms, her shoulders, her face, checking for injury, with a desperation that spoke louder than any words could have. "Illyra," he said, his voice rough, with barely controlled fear. "Illyra, look at me. Are you hurt? Did he?" "I'm all right," she managed, though her own voice still trembled. "He didn't have time. I fought, and I screamed, and the guards came before he could." She stopped, unable to finish the thought, the memory of that gloved hand crushing over her mouth, still vivid enough to make her stomach turn. Cale pulled her into his arms then, holding her tightly enough that she could feel the frantic pounding of his heart even through the fabric between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the aftermath of terror settling slowly into something that might, eventually, become relief. "I should never have allowed even 3 days of calm to lower my guard," Cale said finally, his voice tight with self-recrimination. "I should have had guards posted at the window itself, not simply the door. I failed you tonight, and I do not know how to forgive myself for that." "You didn't fail me," Illyra said, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes, needing him to understand this even through her own lingering fear. "I'm alive, Cale. I fought, and I'm alive, and that isn't failure. That's exactly what should have happened." Fenris arrived moments later, having apparently been searching the grounds below the moment the alarm sounded, and the great wolf's golden eyes carried a fury Illyra had never seen in them before, his massive frame rigid with barely leashed violence as he paced the length of the chamber, nose working furiously at the window frame where the intruder had made his escape. "He found the scent," Cale said, watching his wolf work, "but the trail leads to the outer wall, where the man clearly had a horse waiting. By the time the guards reach the stables, he will already be well beyond the city gates." The guards who had pursued the intruder returned shortly after, confirming exactly what Cale had predicted. The trail lost beyond the palace walls, the man having vanished into the darkness of the countryside, with practiced efficiency, that left little doubt this had been carefully planned, rather than a desperate, impulsive act. "This was no simple thief looking for valuables," one of the guards reported grimly. "He came for her specifically, my lord. He knew exactly which window belonged to her chamber, and he came prepared to scale the wall to reach it. The full weight of this realization settled over the room like a physical presence, and Alira found herself gripping Cale's hand tightly, the earlier bravado that had carried her through the initial fight now giving way to a colder, more lasting fear, as the true scope of the danger she faced became undeniably clear. This was not a note hidden among flowers, meant to frighten from a distance. This was someone willing to come for her directly, to enter the palace itself, and attempt to take her by force, and the knowledge that such a person existed, planning and waiting somewhere beyond these walls, settled into her chest with a weight she was not certain she could carry easily. "I want the entire palace searched," Cale said, his voice hardening into the commanding tone Alira had rarely heard from him, sharp and absolute. "Every servant, every guest, every visitor who has passed through these gates in the last week, questioned thoroughly. Someone within these walls provided information about which window belonged to Alira's chamber, and I intend to find them." "Your Majesty," the guard said carefully, "shall I also send word to Lord Ashgrove's estate, requesting information regarding the whereabouts of his household on this particular night?" Cale's jaw tightened visibly at the suggestion. The same suspicion Morella had voiced days earlier, clearly weighing on his mind now with far greater urgency than before. "Send the request," he said finally. "Carefully worded, but send it regardless. I want to know exactly where every member of that household was tonight, without exception." As the guards departed to begin their search, Cale turned back to Alira, and the fury that had briefly hardened his expression gave way once more to raw, unguarded fear. "I am moving you to a chamber deep within the royal wing," he said, "one with no exterior windows, accessible from outside, guarded on every approach. I should have insisted on this from the moment that note arrived, and I will not make the same mistake twice." Alira did not argue, though something in her chest ached at the thought of retreating further into the palace's protective depths, a life increasingly defined by walls and guards and careful restriction, so different from the quiet, simple freedom she had known in her cottage before any of this began. But she thought, too, of the gloved hand, crushing over her mouth, of the cold certainty in the intruder's voice. "This does not need to hurt, if you simply cooperate," and understood that whatever freedom she sacrificed now, the alternative carried a cost far greater than restricted movement. "Stay with me tonight," she said quietly, surprising herself with the request, though the moment the words left her mouth, she knew she meant them completely. "I don't think I can be alone right now, not after this." Cale did not hesitate. "I will stay as long as you need me to," he said, settling beside her on the edge of the bed, one arm wrapping protectively around her shoulders, while Fenris, still pacing restlessly, finally settled onto the floor near the doorway, positioning himself as an additional barrier between Alira and whatever danger might still lurk beyond it. Sleep did not come easily for either of them that night, and Alira found herself, in the long hours before dawn finally broke over the palace grounds, replaying the attack over and over, searching each memory for details that might help identify who had sent the man through her window, and why. She thought of Cassandra's cold eyes at the fountain, of Bertrand's unexpected kindness, of Morella's careful warnings about ambition wounded, and understood, with growing certainty, that whoever stood behind tonight's attack, they would not simply give up after one failed attempt. The threat had escalated from words hidden among flowers to a man scaling palace walls in the dead of night, and Alira understood, lying awake in the darkness, with Cale's steady heartbeat beneath her cheek, and Fenris's watchful presence guarding the door, that this quiet, careful conflict had crossed some invisible threshold tonight, moving from shadow and suspicion into something far more dangerous, something that would not end until either the threat was fully uncovered and stopped, or until it finally succeeded in claiming what it had come for. By mid-morning, the palace search had turned up its first real lead, and Corwin arrived at the temporary chamber where Alira and Cale had gathered with Bertrand and Morella, his expression grim with the particular satisfaction of a man who had found an answer he did not enjoy uncovering. "A stable hand," Corwin reported, "young, newly hired within the last month, on the recommendation of a household we have not yet been able to trace. He was seen speaking with an unfamiliar rider near the eastern gate 3 nights ago, and this morning, he was nowhere to be found among the staff quarters. His belongings were gone as well, packed hastily, from the look of what remained behind." "Newly hired, within the last month," Morella repeated slowly, her sharp eyes narrowing in thought. That places his arrival at the palace almost precisely at the time the council first began discussing the Eastern Trade Alliance in earnest, well before the Market Square incident ever occurred. You believe this was planned even before Alira entered the picture? Cale asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. I believe, Morella said carefully, that someone within House Ashgrove's circle, or perhaps simply someone eager to see the trade alliance secured through Lady Cassandra's marriage, has been positioning resources within this palace for some time, in anticipation of exactly the kind of complication Alira's arrival represented. Whether they intended this specific plan from the start, or simply adapted an existing foothold to a new purpose, I cannot say with certainty, but the timing troubles me greatly. Bertrand, who had remained largely silent throughout the report, finally spoke, his expression carrying none of its usual careful neutrality. I will have the household recommendation records for every new hire in the past 2 months reviewed personally, he said. If this stable hand came through a forged or falsified reference, I intend to trace exactly whose hand forged it. And if that trail leads to House Ashgrove directly? Elira asked quietly, voicing the question that had hung unspoken over the room since Corwin's report began. Then Lord Ashgrove will answer for it, Cale said, his voice low and hard. Regardless of what it costs the Eastern trade negotiations, I will not sacrifice your safety for the sake of a treaty, Alara, whatever the Council believes about the necessity of that alliance. The room fell quiet at the weight of his words, and Alira, watching the tight set of his jaw, understood that whatever careful political balance Cale had been navigating since her arrival, tonight's attack had shifted something fundamental in how he weighed the competing demands on his crown. He had spoken of duty and diplomacy with genuine concern in the days before, but the sight of a man's gloved hand, nearly silencing her scream, had apparently burned away whatever patience remained for careful, measured caution. We still lack proof, Bertrand cautioned, though even his careful voice carried less of its usual restraint than before. Suspicion is not evidence, Your Majesty, however strongly circumstance may point in one direction. If we act against House Ashgrove without certainty, we risk creating exactly the kind of conflict the Eastern Alliance was meant to prevent, and we risk it without even confirming the true source of last night's attack. Then find the proof, Cale said flatly, quickly, because I promise you, Bertrand, if I discover Lord Ashgrove's hand behind that man who climbed through Alira's window, no treaty in this world will save him from my response. The meeting continued a while longer, plans forming around the search for the missing stable hand and the falsified references that had apparently allowed him access to the palace's inner workings, but Alira found her attention drifting, exhaustion, and lingering fear, making it difficult to focus on the careful political calculations filling the room around her. She caught Cale's eye once during a pause in the discussion, and the raw protectiveness she found there, mixed with something that looked almost like desperation, told her clearly that whatever calm authority he presented to his advisors, the events of the previous night had shaken him as deeply as they had shaken her, perhaps more so, given the weight of guilt he seemed determined to carry for having failed, in his own mind, to protect her fully. As the meeting finally dispersed, Alira found herself being led toward the new chamber, deep within the royal wing, its single heavy door guarded by no fewer than 4 soldiers, its complete absence of exterior windows, a stark reminder of exactly how seriously the night's events had been taken. She stepped inside, taking in the smaller, plainer space, so different from the elegant guest chamber she had occupied before, and felt a complicated mixture of gratitude for the safety it offered and grief for the freedom it represented giving up. Cale lingered in the doorway as the guards took their positions outside, watching her survey the room with an expression that seemed to read every conflicted emotion crossing her face. I know it isn't what you wanted, he said quietly. A life spent behind guarded doors, further from the world than you have ever lived before. It isn't, Alira admitted honestly, but it's better than the alternative, and I understand that now, in a way I don't think I fully did before last night. She managed a faint, tired smile in his direction. I told you I wouldn't run. I meant it. This is simply the cost of staying, and I'm willing to pay it, for now, until whoever did this is found and stopped. Cale crossed the room and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, lingering there a moment longer than the gesture strictly required, as though needing the reassurance of her steady presence as much as she needed his. We will find them, he promised, his voice quiet but absolute. I swear to you, Alira, Whoever sent that man through your window, they will answer for it, and you will not have to live behind guarded doors forever. I only need time to make certain the danger has truly passed, before I can promise you anything less." Illyra nodded, leaning into the comfort of his presence a moment longer, before he finally departed to continue overseeing the search, leaving her alone with her thoughts, the memory of the previous night's terror, and a growing, steady resolve that whatever came next, she intended to face it, not as a frightened girl hiding behind a market stall, but as someone determined, finally, to stand her ground. The proof arrived 7 days later, carried into the palace by a merchant Illyra had never met, a man named Godric who dealt in fine fabrics, and had, by chance, been present at a roadside inn on the very night of the attack, where he witnessed something he had not thought significant until word of the king's investigation reached his ears through the usual channels of market gossip. He was brought before Cale, Bertrand, and Illyra in the same small study where the earlier investigation had first taken shape, his hands twisting nervously in his lap as he recounted what he had seen. A rider, matching the description of the missing stable hand, meeting briefly with a woman in fine traveling clothes at the inn's rear entrance, their conversation hushed but their body language unmistakably familiar, as though this was not their first such meeting. "Could you describe the woman?" Bertrand asked, his voice carrying the careful precision of a man who had learned long ago not to lead a witness toward the answer he expected. Godric described her carefully. Dark hair elaborately styled despite the late hour and the modest inn where they met. A traveling cloak of fine violet fabric that, he noted with the practiced eye of a fabric merchant, would have cost more than most common travelers could ever afford. Illyra felt the room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees as the description settled into place, matching precisely the memory she carried of Lady Cassandra, standing at the fountain, cold and calculating beneath her practiced courtesy. She glanced at Cale and found his jaw already tight, his eyes hard with a fury he was clearly struggling to contain in front of the frightened merchant still sitting before them. "Thank you," Cale said finally, his voice controlled despite the visible tension radiating from every line of his posture. "You have done the crown a great service, coming forward with this information. You will be compensated for your trouble and for the risk you have taken in speaking honestly." Once Godric had been escorted out, the study fell into heavy silence, broken finally by Bertrand's careful, measured voice. "Your Majesty, this is a serious accusation. We must proceed carefully, gather further confirmation before—" "I have had enough of careful," Cale said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way Illyra had not heard from him before. "A man's testimony places Lady Cassandra in direct contact with the very stable hand who provided access to Illyra's chamber, on the exact night of the attack. How much further confirmation do you require, Bertrand, before you accept that House Ashgrove's daughter has been orchestrating attacks against my mate within my own palace walls? I require enough confirmation that when you confront her, and confront her family, the accusation cannot be dismissed as unfounded suspicion, born of jealousy or misunderstanding," Bertrand said firmly, though his voice softened slightly at the visible strain in Cale's expression. "Your Majesty, I share your fury. Truly, I do. But if we act rashly now, House Ashgrove will simply deny everything, and we will have burned whatever leverage this discovery grants us, without securing the justice you seek." Illyra, who had remained quiet through the exchange, found herself agreeing, cautiously, with Bertrand's counsel, though every instinct in her also wanted immediate confrontation, immediate answers, an end to the fear that had shadowed her every movement since the note first arrived hidden among flowers. "What would you suggest?" she asked. Bertrand considered the question carefully. "A private audience," he said finally. "Not a formal accusation before the full council, which would give Lady Cassandra time to prepare denials and mount a defense with her family's support. A quiet, direct confrontation, where she does not expect the depth of evidence already gathered against her, and where her reaction, whatever it may be, might reveal far more than any formal interrogation ever could." Cale considered this, some of the fury in his expression giving way to calculating thought. "Tomorrow evening," he said finally, "I will request her presence under the guise of discussing the trade alliance further, as though nothing has changed. Illyra, I want you present as well, though hidden until the moment is right. I want Cassandra to understand fully that her actions have been seen, and that hiding behind her family's standing will not protect her from consequence. The following evening arrived with a tension that seemed to hum through the very stones of the palace, and Alira found herself waiting in a small antechamber, adjoining the private study Kale had chosen for the confrontation, her heart pounding as she listened, through the thin wall, to the sound of Cassandra's arrival, her voice carrying the same practiced warmth Alira remembered from their first meeting at the fountain. "Your Majesty," Cassandra said smoothly, "I confess I did not expect a summons so soon after our last conversation. I hope this means you have reconsidered my father's proposal regarding the Eastern Alliance." In a manner of speaking, Kale said, his voice carrying a careful neutrality that gave nothing away. "I wish to discuss recent events with you directly, Lady Cassandra. Events I believe you may have some insight into." A brief pause followed, and Alira, straining to listen through the wall, thought she detected the faintest shift in Cassandra's tone when she spoke again, still smooth, but carrying now a note of caution that had not been present before. "I'm not certain what events you mean, Your Majesty." "The threat delivered to Alira's chamber, hidden among a gift of flowers," Kale said, his voice hardening slightly, "and the man who scaled the palace wall 7 nights ago, attempting to take her by force." "How dreadful," Cassandra said, though the careful modulation of her voice suggested performance rather than genuine surprise. "I am glad to hear she was unharmed. Surely you do not believe I have any connection to such an ugly business, Your Majesty." This was the moment Kale had planned for, and Alira, listening through the wall, understood it was time. She stepped through the connecting door into the study, and watched Cassandra's carefully composed expression falter, just slightly, at her unexpected appearance. "A merchant named Godric witnessed you meeting privately with the missing stable hand, at a roadside inn, on the very night he attempted to force his way into my chamber," Alira said, her voice steadier than she felt, though the months of fear and careful watchfulness had, perhaps, prepared her for this moment more than she realized. "He described your traveling cloak in detail. Violet, fine fabric, the kind few beyond your family's standing could afford." Cassandra's composure cracked further, a flash of genuine alarm crossing her features, before she visibly forced it back beneath a mask of offended dignity. "This is absurd," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. "A common merchant's word against mine? Your Majesty, surely you do not intend to entertain such baseless accusations." "I did not act on his word alone," Kale said coldly. "I have spent 7 days gathering evidence, Lady Cassandra, tracing the falsified references that allowed a hired agent access to my palace, tracing the payment records that funded his escape, and tracing, most damningly, his prior movements to a location matching your family's hunting lodge along the Eastern Road, where he was seen on no fewer than 3 occasions in the weeks before the attack." The color drained from Cassandra's face at this final detail, and Alira understood, watching the transformation, that whatever evidence Kale had claimed to still be gathering when they first discussed this confrontation, he had, in fact, secured far more than he had initially let on, perhaps waiting for exactly this moment to reveal the full depth of what had been uncovered. "I want to know why," Kale said, his voice quiet now, though the quiet carried more menace than any shout could have. "Why you believe threatening, and nearly abducting an innocent woman, was an acceptable path towards securing a marriage I have refused your family's proposal for, repeatedly, over the course of years." For a long moment, Cassandra said nothing, her carefully maintained composure finally, completely shattering, as tears welled in her eyes, though whether from genuine remorse, or simply the panic of being caught, Alira could not immediately determine. "You don't understand the pressure I've faced," Cassandra said finally, her voice breaking. "My father has staked everything on this alliance, Your Majesty. Years of careful positioning, years of promises made to our allies based on the assumption that our houses would eventually unite. When word came of what happened in that market square, of your wolf-breaking formation for some village herbalist, I panicked. I believed, if she simply left, quietly, before the bond could take deeper root, everything could return to how it was meant to be. So you hired a man to threaten her," Kale said, his voice hard with disbelief and fury in equal measure. "And when threats failed, you hired him to break into my palace and take her by force." "I never intended real harm," Cassandra said, though the words rang hollow, even to Alira's ears, given the memory of that gloved hand crushing over her mouth, the cold certainty in the intruder's voice. I only wanted her frightened enough to leave willingly. I told him, explicitly, that she was not to be harmed, only removed from the palace and returned to her village, far enough away that the bond might fade without further interference. Removed by force is still harm, Cassandra, Alira said quietly, finding her voice at last, amid the shock of hearing the plan laid out so plainly. Whatever careful instructions you believe you gave him, he had his hand over my mouth and was prepared to carry me from that window regardless of my resistance. That is not a gentle removal. That is an assault, dressed up in language that lets you sleep at night. Cassandra flinched at the directness of the words, and for the first time since entering the room, something like genuine shame crossed her features, rather than simple panic at being discovered. I am sorry, she said, though the apology felt small and inadequate against the scope of what had actually occurred. I let fear and ambition carry me somewhere I should never have gone. I understand that now, seeing the reality of it laid out before me, rather than the careful abstraction I allowed myself to believe in. Cale's expression remained hard, unmoved by the apparent remorse. Your understanding comes 7 days too late, and only after being caught, he said. I will be informing your father personally of what has occurred here tonight, and I expect House Ashgrove to answer fully for the actions taken under its name and its resources, regardless of whatever personal desperation drove you to this choice. Please, Cassandra said, her composure fully abandoned now, panic evident in every line of her posture. My father knew nothing of this, Your Majesty. I swear it. If he learns what I have done, the consequences will fall on our entire house, not simply on me. Then you should have considered that before hiring a man to break into my palace, Cale said flatly. I will decide what consequences are appropriate, Lady Cassandra, but I promise you, they will be significant, and they will be public enough that no other noble house within this kingdom mistakes my patience for weakness a second time. Alira watched Cassandra's carefully constructed world collapse around her, and found, to her own surprise, that the satisfaction she had expected to feel at this confrontation's resolution was tempered by something more complicated, a quiet understanding of the desperation that could drive a person toward such choices, even as she refused to excuse the harm that desperation had caused. She thought of her own fear, her own careful instinct to hide rather than be seen, and recognized, uncomfortably, that fear alone did not justify the paths a person chose to walk because of it. The guards were summoned shortly after, and Cassandra was escorted from the palace under careful watch, her fate now resting in the hands of a formal inquiry that would determine exactly what consequences House Ashgrove and its daughter would face for the danger they had brought against the crown's chosen mate. As the door closed behind her, Alira finally allowed herself to exhale fully, the weight of 7 days' fear beginning, slowly, to lift from her shoulders. It's over, she said quietly, though the words carried more question than certainty. This particular threat is over, Cale said, crossing the room to pull her into his arms, the tension he had carried throughout the confrontation, finally easing as he held her close. But I do not believe it will be the last challenge we face, Alira. Not while some within this kingdom continue to value political convenience over the choices of those who bear the true weight of this crown's decisions. Alira leaned into his embrace, grateful beyond words for the resolution this confrontation had finally brought, even as Cale's cautious words settled uneasily alongside her relief. Word of Cassandra's confession reached Lord Ashgrove within a day, delivered by Cale's own hand in a formal letter that laid out the evidence gathered against his daughter, without exaggeration or accusation beyond what could be proven. His response arrived 3 days later, carried by a rider whose grim expression suggested he had not enjoyed the long journey from the Eastern Territories, and Cale called Alira, Bertrand, and Mirella together in the study to review it before deciding how to proceed. Lord Ashgrove's letter was, to Alira's surprise, neither defensive nor dismissive. He wrote of his shock and shame upon learning what his daughter had done, insisting he had known nothing of her actions until Cale's letter arrived, and offered, in careful, formal language, both a full apology on behalf of his house and a proposal for how the matter might be resolved without further damaging the Eastern trade relationship that had taken years to build. He offers to withdraw Cassandra from court entirely, Bertrand said, reading the letter's key points aloud for the benefit of those present, sending her to a distant estate for an extended period, effectively removing her from any position of influence, and he offers additional trade concessions as a gesture of goodwill, separate entirely from the original alliance negotiations. "Do you believe him?" Elira asked. "That he knew nothing of what she planned?" Cale considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe it is possible," he said. "Lord Ashgrove has always struck me as a proud man, but not a cruel one, and the concessions he offers now go well beyond what simple political calculation would require if he were merely trying to protect his own position. I think it is equally possible that his daughter's desperation to secure this match grew from pressures he placed upon her, even if he never intended those pressures to drive her toward such extreme action." "Then he bears some responsibility regardless," Morella observed quietly, "even if his hands remain technically clean of the actual conspiracy." "I agree," Cale said, "which is why, alongside accepting his proposed concessions, I intend to make clear that any further incidents involving House Ashgrove, regardless of how distant the connection to Cassandra herself, will be met with far less patience than I have shown in this instance." The formal resolution took the better part of 2 more weeks to finalize, correspondence traveling back and forth between the palace and House Ashgrove's estate, careful negotiations ensuring that justice was served without unraveling the broader diplomatic relationship the Eastern Alliance still represented. Cassandra herself departed for a distant estate before the arrangements were even fully settled, and Elira found, watching from a palace window as a modest carriage carried her away from the capital, that she felt no particular satisfaction in the sight, only a quiet, complicated relief that the immediate danger had passed. In the days that followed, life within the palace began, slowly, to settle into something resembling normalcy, though Elira noticed the changes it had wrought in how she moved through her days, a heightened awareness of doorways and windows that had not existed before the attack, a habit of counting the guards posted along familiar corridors, small vigilances that she suspected might never fully disappear, regardless of how safe she eventually came to feel within these walls. Cale, too, seemed changed by the ordeal, his protectiveness sharpening into something more deliberate, more carefully considered, as though the near loss of her had taught him lessons about vigilance he had not fully absorbed before. He began including her, gently but persistently, in more of his daily routines, not simply as a guest to be entertained in quiet gardens, but as someone whose presence and perspective he genuinely valued in matters both large and small. "I want you to understand something," he told her one evening, as they walked together through the palace grounds, Fenris trotting ahead of them, with none of the earlier tension that had marked his movements throughout the crisis. "What happened with Cassandra, it changed how I see my responsibility toward you. I cannot simply offer you comfort and affection, Elira, and consider my obligation fulfilled. I owe you real protection, real partnership, if you are willing to continue building this bond with me." "I am willing," Elira said, surprising herself with how easily the words came, how little hesitation remained, where once uncertainty had governed nearly every choice she made, regarding this strange, unexpected path her life had taken. "I told you before, Cale, I don't intend to run from this, whatever difficulties still lie ahead." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, something in his expression carrying a weight beyond simple gratitude for her continued presence. "Then I have something I wish to ask you," he said, "though I do not intend to press for an answer tonight, only to plant the question and let you consider it in your own time." Elira's heart quickened at the seriousness in his voice. "What is it?" "I wish to formally register our bond with the Crown's registry," Cale said carefully, "not simply as guest and host, or even as 2 people exploring a connection neither of us fully chose. I wish to claim you, properly, as my mate, before the full court and the kingdom beyond it. I understand this is a significant step, one that would change your life in ways neither threats nor attacks have yet managed to fully accomplish. I do not ask lightly, and I will understand entirely if you need more time before answering." Elira absorbed the weight of his words slowly, understanding immediately the magnitude of what he was proposing, a public claim that would eliminate any lingering ambiguity about her place within this world, and eliminate, too, any remaining possibility of quietly stepping back into the simple, invisible life she had once known. It would mean vulnerability of an entirely different kind than the physical danger she had already faced, a permanent visibility she could never again retreat from. But it would mean, too, an end to the careful uncertainty that had shadowed their every interaction since the market square, a clear declaration that whatever political pressures or ambitious rivals might yet emerge, Kale intended to stand beside her openly, without hesitation or compromise. "I need time," she said finally, honestly. "Not because I doubt what I feel for you, Kale. I think I've known, since that day in the garden when you first asked my forgiveness for things that were never your fault to apologize for, that this bond meant something real and lasting. But this is not a small choice, and I would rather consider it carefully than answer quickly, simply because my heart wants to say yes." "Take whatever time you need," Kale said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I have waited this long to find you, Alira. I can wait a while longer for your answer, if it means you arrive at it with the clarity and certainty such a choice deserves." As they resumed their walk through the quiet evening gardens, Fenris circling back to press warmly against Alira's side, she found her thoughts already turning toward the question Kale had posed. Weighing it carefully against everything that had happened since that first terrifying moment behind the market stall, and understanding, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever answer she eventually gave, her life had already changed too completely to ever fully return to the quiet, hidden existence she had once called home. Alira returned to her cottage for the first time in nearly a month, escorted by Corwin and 2 additional guards Kale had insisted upon despite the resolution of the Cassandra affair, and found the small building exactly as she had left it. Dust settled thin across the floor, the herb jars still carefully covered against the elements, everything precisely where her hurried hands had placed it, before departing for the palace so many weeks earlier. She had asked to make this journey alone, or as alone as Kale's continued caution would permit, needing space to think through his question, away from the palace's constant currents of politics and watchful eyes. Corwin and the guards remained outside, giving her the privacy of the small cottage to herself, and Alira moved slowly through the familiar rooms, running her fingers over her mother's worn wooden spoon, the chipped mortar and pestle, the small collection of remedies that had once represented the entirety of her modest, careful life. She sat at the worn table, where she had eaten countless meals with her mother before the sickness took her, and allowed herself, finally, to think honestly about everything that had happened since the drums first sounded in the market square. The fear, certainly, remained vivid in her memory, the gloved hand over her mouth, the cold certainty of a threat hidden among flowers, the calculating eyes of a woman desperate enough to risk everything for an alliance she believed she deserved. But alongside the fear sat something else, something warmer and far more persistent, the memory of golden eyes finding hers across a crowded square, of a king who knelt in the dirt rather than commanding her to rise, of quiet gardens and honest conversations, and a bond that had settled into her chest like something she had been missing her entire life, without knowing its shape. She thought, too, of Morella's careful counsel, that the bond was not her enemy, only a fact to be shaped by the choices made around it, and of Bertrand's unexpected kindness, and of Fenris pressing warm and steady against her side through every moment of fear that had followed her since arriving at the palace. Whatever dangers still lingered, whatever political currents continued to swirl around a match the council had never anticipated or particularly welcomed, she understood, sitting alone in her mother's cottage with the autumn light slanting gold through familiar windows, that she did not wish to return to the quiet, hidden existence she had known before. She wanted the life Kale had offered her, difficult and complicated as it promised to be. She wanted Fenris curled at her feet in the evenings, and quiet walks through palace gardens, and the particular warmth of Kale's steady presence beside her, not because the bond compelled her toward it, but because she had come, genuinely and completely, to love him. The realization settled over her with a clarity that eased something in her chest that had remained tight and uncertain since the moment he first asked his question in the palace gardens. She rose from the table, gathered a few small mementos of her mother to carry back with her, careful, deliberate choices rather than the frantic packing of her first departure, and stepped outside to find Corwin waiting patiently near the garden gate. "I'm ready to return," she said, and something in her voice must have carried the weight of her decision, because Corwin's expression shifted immediately into something like relieved understanding. "His Majesty will be glad to hear it, my lady," he said, though he was careful not to presume the exact nature of her decision, escorting her back toward the waiting horses with the same quiet professionalism he had shown throughout every stage of the ordeal they had weathered together. The journey back to the palace felt different than her first uncertain ride weeks earlier, the landscape no longer foreign and intimidating, but familiar now in its own strange way. Roads she had traveled enough times to recognize each bend and rise, until finally the palace towers appeared once more against the darkening evening sky, no longer simply a place of unfamiliar grandeur, but something closer, now, to a second home. Kale was waiting in the same garden courtyard where their first proper conversation had taken place, and the moment his eyes found her approaching, Alira watched something anxious in his posture ease slightly, though he did not press for her answer immediately, allowing her the dignity of choosing her own moment to speak. "I went home," she said, once she had dismounted, and Corwin had discreetly withdrawn to give them privacy. "I needed to sit in my mother's cottage, and remember exactly who I was before any of this began, before I could answer your question honestly." "And what did you find there?" Kale asked, his voice carrying careful restraint despite the visible hope beneath it. "I found that I don't want to go back," Alira said simply. "Not permanently. Not to the quiet, hidden life I lived before. I love my mother's memory, and I will always carry that cottage and everything she taught me with pride. But it isn't where I belong anymore, Kale. Not since the moment your wolf found me hiding behind that market stall." Kale's breath caught audibly, and Alira continued before he could speak, needing to finish the thought she had carried carefully across the entire journey back to the palace. "Yes," she said. "My answer is yes. I want to register our bond, properly, before the full court and the kingdom beyond it. Not because I fear what happens if I refuse, and not simply because the bond itself compels me toward you. I want it because I have come to love you, genuinely and completely, and I am no longer willing to hide that truth behind fear of what others might think or say." The relief and joy that broke across Kale's face at her words struck Alira with an intensity that stole her own breath in turn, and he crossed the remaining distance between them quickly, pulling her into an embrace that carried none of the careful restraint their earlier interactions had maintained, instead holding her as though he intended never to let go again. "I love you," he said, the words clearly having waited to be spoken for some time, held carefully in check while he gave her the space to reach her own decision without pressure. "I think I loved you from the moment Fenris broke formation in that market square, though I did not fully understand it until I saw you standing in the dirt behind those crates, frightened and brave in equal measure, refusing to simply crumble beneath circumstances that would have broken many people far more accustomed to power and privilege than you had ever known." "I love you too," Alira said, the words feeling both entirely new and somehow inevitable, as though she had been building toward this exact confession since that very first, terrifying moment their eyes met across the crowded square. Even through all the fear, even through Cassandra's threats, and that terrible night at the window, some part of me has known this for weeks now. I simply needed time to trust it fully, to be certain I was choosing this life for myself, rather than simply being carried along by circumstances neither of us controlled. Fenris arrived moments later, drawn, it seemed, by some instinct that told him this particular conversation warranted his presence, and the great wolf pressed himself against them both with a low, contented sound that made Alira laugh despite the emotional weight of the moment, the tension of the past weeks finally beginning to ease into something lighter, something closer to genuine, uncomplicated joy. "We should tell Morella and Bertrand," Alira said eventually, once they had both recovered enough composure to think practically about what came next, and begin whatever preparations a formal registration requires. "There is much to prepare," Kale admitted, though his voice carried none of the earlier weariness that had accompanied discussions of council sessions and political complications. "A formal registration before the full court is no small ceremony, Alira. It will require weeks of preparation, and it will draw attention from every corner of the kingdom, nobility and commoners alike, all eager to witness the moment their king formally claims his mate." "I understand," Alira said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the prospect no longer filled her with the same paralyzing fear it might have weeks earlier. She had faced threats and attacks, and the cold, calculating ambition of a woman, desperate enough to risk everything, for a match that was never truly hers to claim. Whatever attention a formal ceremony might draw, she found herself ready, finally, to meet it not with the instinct to hide, but with the quiet, steady courage she had discovered in herself over the course of this long, difficult month. That evening, as word of their decision spread quietly through the palace's inner circle, Bertrand arrived to offer his formal congratulations, his careful neutrality giving way, for perhaps the first time since Alira had known him, to genuine warmth. "I confess," he said, "I did not expect, when I first voiced my concerns in that council chamber, that events would unfold toward this particular conclusion. I am glad to have been wrong, my lady. You have shown a strength through this ordeal that I believe will serve this kingdom well, in whatever role you come to hold within it. Mirella's congratulations, when they arrived the following morning, carried a different weight entirely, the old scholar producing a small, worn book from among her collection, its pages filled with careful notes on the history of bonded pairs who had come before them. A gift, she said, pressing it into Elira's hands. The accumulated wisdom of those who walked this path before you, both its triumphs and its difficulties. I believe you will find it useful, in the years ahead, when the challenges of this bond grow complicated in ways neither threats nor attacks can fully prepare you for. As the preparations for the formal registration began in earnest, filling the palace with a new kind of energy, tailors and advisors and ceremonial planners moving through the corridors with purposeful urgency, Elira found herself, more than once, pausing to marvel at how completely her life had transformed since that terrified morning in the market square, when she had ducked behind a crate of grain hoping desperately to remain unseen. The tailors arrived first, a small team of skilled seamstresses, led by a sharp-eyed woman named Odalise, who studied Elira with the same careful assessment a general might apply to a battlefield, taking measurements and murmuring quietly to her assistants about fabrics and colors that would suit both the formal weight of the ceremony and, as she put it, the quiet strength she could already see in Elira's bearing. You needn't dress as a noble, born to silk and jewels, Odalise said, holding a length of deep green fabric against Elira's shoulder, considering the effect with narrowed eyes. The court has seen enough of that already, and frankly, my lady, they grow bored of it. Better to dress as exactly what you are, someone who earned her place through courage rather than birthright. The kingdom will respect that more than any borrowed elegance. Elira found herself grateful for the woman's plain speaking, so different from the careful, calculating courtesy she had grown accustomed to among certain corners of the palace, and the fittings that followed, though exhausting, carried an unexpected warmth as Odalise and her assistants worked, chattering easily about fabric and stitching, while Elira stood patiently at the center of their careful attention. Between fittings, she spent her mornings with Mirella, poring over the old scholar's worn book on bonded pairs, learning the histories of those who had walked similar paths before her, some triumphant, others cautionary, each offering small pieces of wisdom that settled into her thoughts alongside her own growing understanding of what this new life would require. She learned of a bonded queen, 3 generations past, who had faced fierce resistance from a council convinced her common birth would weaken the crown's standing, only to become, within a decade, one of the most beloved rulers the kingdom had ever known, her policies reshaping how common folk across the realm accessed medicine and education alike. Perhaps that is your path as well, Mirella suggested one morning, watching Elira read the account with quiet fascination. You bring knowledge to this palace that none born to nobility possess, child. The healing arts, the practical wisdom of those who live close to the land. That is not a weakness to be hidden behind fine silks, whatever certain members of the council might believe. It is a strength this kingdom has long needed more of, at its highest levels. The suggestion took root in Elira's thoughts, and she found herself, in quiet moments between fittings and lessons, beginning to imagine what her life within the palace might look like beyond the ceremony itself, not simply as Kale's mate, standing quietly beside his throne, but as someone with her own purpose, her own contribution to make toward the kingdom she was preparing to formally join. Not every development during those weeks of preparation was without its complications. A letter arrived one afternoon from a minor noble house in the Northern Territories, its tone carefully polite but unmistakably skeptical, questioning whether a formal registration with an unregistered commoner might set a troubling precedent for future successions, and Elira watched Kale's jaw tighten as he read it, before setting it aside with visible effort at composure. There will be more letters like this, he said, when she asked about it later, over a quiet dinner shared in the small hall that had become, over the weeks, comfortably familiar to them both. Not everyone within this kingdom will celebrate our choice as readily as Bertrand and Mirella have come to. Some will question it out of genuine concern for tradition and stability, others simply out of prejudice toward those born without noble blood. Does that trouble you? Elira asked, watching him carefully for any sign of the hesitation that had, in earlier weeks, sometimes crept into his voice when political pressures mounted against their bond. "It troubles me that you must bear the weight of such judgment," Cale said honestly. "Not that it changes my resolve in any way. I have made my choice, Illyra, as clearly and completely as any choice I have ever made in my life. Those who cannot accept it will simply need time to adjust, or they will need to accustom themselves to disagreeing quietly, because I do not intend to reconsider a decision that has brought me more genuine happiness than any political calculation ever could." His certainty steadied something in Illyra that the Northern letter's careful skepticism had briefly unsettled, and as the preparations continued, drawing steadily closer to the day of the formal ceremony, she found herself growing more confident, not less, in the choice she had made, understanding that whatever resistance still lingered among certain corners of the nobility, she had already weathered far greater threats than mere written skepticism, and had emerged from each of them stronger rather than diminished. She had not asked for any of this, had not sought the attention of a king or the complicated weight of a bond that came with both profound joy and genuine danger. But standing now in the palace she had once feared, surrounded by people who had proven themselves, through fire and threat and careful, patient kindness, to be genuine allies rather than simple obstacles, she understood that whatever fear had once governed her choices, she had finally found something worth being seen for. 3 weeks before the formal registration ceremony, a scandal erupted through the palace, with the sudden, violent force of a summer storm, and Illyra found herself, once again, at the center of a conflict she had not anticipated and could not immediately understand. It began with whispers, the kind that traveled through palace corridors faster than any formal announcement, whispers claiming that Illyra's family held a hidden connection to a rebel faction from the Northern Territories, a group that had, decades earlier, attempted to overthrow Cale's grandfather during a period of civil unrest the kingdom had worked hard to leave behind. The rumor suggested that Illyra's mother had once sheltered members of this faction, and that Illyra herself, whatever her innocent appearance, might carry loyalties that made her presence beside the throne not merely politically inconvenient, but genuinely dangerous to the kingdom's stability. Illyra first heard the rumor from Corwin, who arrived at her chamber early one morning with an expression of controlled alarm that immediately told her something significant had gone wrong. "My lady," he said, "I would not trouble you with palace gossip normally, but this particular rumor has grown serious enough that His Majesty believes you should hear it directly, before it reaches you through less careful channels." He relayed the accusation as gently as such a thing could be relayed, and Illyra felt her stomach drop with a familiar, sickening dread as she absorbed the implications. Her mother, sheltering rebels, herself, potentially, a hidden threat to the very throne she was preparing to formally join. It was absurd, she knew immediately, a fabrication with no basis in the quiet, careful life she had actually lived. But she understood, too, from painful experience, that truth did not always matter as much as the damage a well-placed rumor could inflict before it was properly disproven. "Where did this come from?" she asked, though some cold, suspicious part of her mind had already begun forming its own theories. "We are still tracing its origin," Corwin admitted. "But His Majesty asked me to bring you to him immediately. There is a council session called for this afternoon, and given the seriousness of the accusation, he believes you should be present to address it directly, rather than allowing the rumor to circulate unanswered." The council chamber, when Illyra entered it that afternoon, felt entirely different from the quiet garden conversations and private study meetings that had defined most of her palace experience thus far. Rows of nobles filled the chamber, their expressions ranging from open curiosity to poorly disguised hostility, and Illyra felt every eye in the room settle on her the moment she crossed the threshold, the weight of their combined scrutiny pressing down on her like a physical force. Cale sat at the head of the chamber, his expression carefully controlled, though Illyra could see, in the tension around his eyes, exactly how much this sudden crisis had rattled him. Bertrand stood near the front of the assembled nobles, and beside him, to Illyra's surprise, stood a man she did not recognize, his fine robes marking him clearly as a member of the nobility, though his expression carried a smugness that immediately put her on guard. "Lord Varric has brought a serious accusation before this council," Bertrand said formally, once the chamber had settled into attentive silence. "He claims to possess evidence connecting Illyra's family to the Northern Rebellion of 2 decades past. evidence he believes disqualifies her from any formal claim to the throne's mate registry. Lord Varric stepped forward, producing a weathered scroll that he unfurled with theatrical care, before the assembled council. "I have here a testimony," he said, his voice carrying the smooth, practiced confidence of a man accustomed to swaying rooms full of skeptical listeners, from a former soldier who served during the Northern Uprising, describing a healer, matching the description of Alira's mother, who provided medical aid to wounded rebels following the battle at Thornwood Pass. Alira's mind raced, searching her memory for anything her mother might have told her about that period, and found, to her mounting unease, that she genuinely did not know enough about her mother's early life to immediately dismiss the claim as impossible. Her mother had rarely spoken of the years before Alira's birth, and what little she had shared painted a picture of a woman who had traveled extensively as a young healer, before settling in the eastern hills, a history vague enough that Lord Varric's fabrication, if fabrication it truly was, found uncomfortable room to take root. "This testimony," Cale said, his voice cutting through the murmuring that had begun to spread through the chamber, "comes from a single, unnamed soldier, recounted secondhand through Lord Varric himself. I would ask the council to consider how easily such testimony could be manufactured, particularly given the timing of its appearance, mere weeks before a formal registration. This same council has already expressed varying degrees of reservation about." "Your Majesty," Lord Varric said smoothly, "I understand the accusation is unwelcome, given your personal investment in this matter, but surely the council's duty to the kingdom's security must outweigh personal feeling. If there is even a possibility that this woman's family harbors sympathies toward those who once sought to overthrow your own grandfather, does the council not owe it to the realm's stability to investigate fully, before proceeding with a formal registration that would place her permanently within the royal household?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through portions of the chamber, and Alira felt the familiar cold grip of fear tightening around her chest, not simply for herself, but for the mother she could no longer ask to confirm or deny the accusation being leveled against her memory. She thought of Cassandra's careful conspiracy weeks earlier, and wondered, with growing certainty, whether this too traced back to some similar source, ambition or prejudice, finding new avenues to attack a bond that continued to disrupt carefully laid political plans. "May I speak?" Alira asked, her voice carrying further into the chamber than she expected, silencing the murmuring nobles as every eye once again settled on her. Cale's gaze found hers, offering silent support, and after a brief nod of permission, Alira stepped forward into the center of the chamber, understanding that whatever fear she carried, hiding from this confrontation, would only lend credence to accusations she knew, with complete certainty, to be false, regardless of how convincingly Lord Varric had presented them. "I do not know every detail of my mother's life before I was born," Alira said, her voice steady, despite the trembling she felt in her hands. She rarely spoke of those years, and I never thought to press her for details, the way children rarely do, until it is too late to ask. "But I know the woman who raised me, who taught me to heal fevers and set broken bones, who worked herself to exhaustion, tending to every sick child in our village, regardless of their family's ability to pay for her care. If she once tended wounded soldiers on a battlefield, whatever side of that conflict they fought for, I believe it was because she was a healer first, and a healer does not typically ask which side deserves saving before offering aid to someone in pain." A different quality of silence settled over the chamber at her words, and Alira pressed forward, gathering courage from the steadiness of her own voice. "If Lord Varric's testimony proves true, that my mother once helped wounded men during a terrible conflict, I do not believe that reflects sympathy toward rebellion, but simple compassion toward suffering, regardless of its source. And if it proves false, invented specifically to derail a registration that has already survived one attempt at sabotage through threats and violence, then I believe this council owes it to itself to consider carefully who benefits from spreading such convenient, unverifiable rumors so close to the ceremony itself." Lord Varric's confident expression flickered, just slightly, at the pointed implication, and Bertrand, watching the exchange with sharp, assessing eyes, stepped forward to address the chamber directly. "I would ask this council to consider Lord Varric's own recent history," he said. "His family has long maintained close ties with House Ashgrove, ties strengthened considerably through several profitable trade arrangements over the past decade. Given Lady Cassandra's recent, well-documented attempt to remove Illyra from this palace, through far more direct means, is it truly so implausible that House Ashgrove's allies might now attempt a subtler approach toward the same goal? The chamber erupted into fresh murmuring at this revelation, and Illyra watched Lord Varric's composure crack further, a flush of anger, and something like panic crossing his features, before he forced his expression back into careful neutrality. "I resent the implication, Bertrand," he said sharply. "My testimony stands on its own merits, regardless of whatever connections my family maintains." "Then produce the soldier who gave you this testimony," Cale said, his voice hard and final. "Bring him before this council, in person, to answer questions directly, rather than hiding behind second-hand accounts conveniently impossible to verify. Until you can do so, Lord Varric, I consider this accusation unproven, and I will not allow unproven rumor to derail a registration this council has already reviewed and approved through proper channels." Lord Varric opened his mouth as though to argue further, then seemed to think better of it, offering instead a stiff, formal bow before retreating from the center of the chamber. His earlier confidence considerably diminished, though not entirely extinguished. Illyra watched him go, understanding that whatever setback this confrontation represented for him, she had not seen the last of whatever scheme House Ashgrove's allies intended to pursue against her place within the palace. The council session concluded shortly after, the immediate crisis contained though not fully resolved, and Illyra found herself, once the chamber had emptied, sinking into a nearby chair, with the sudden, overwhelming exhaustion that followed the release of prolonged tension. Cale crossed to her side immediately, kneeling before her chair, with visible concern etched across his features. "You handled that with more grace than I could have managed in your position," he said quietly. "I am sorry you were forced to defend your own mother's memory before a chamber full of strangers, many of whom were eager to believe the worst, simply because it suited their political interests." "I meant what I said," Illyra replied, some of her earlier steadiness returning, as the immediate danger receded. "About my mother, about healers helping the wounded regardless of allegiance. Whatever Lord Varric's true purpose in raising this accusation, I don't believe he understood how completely it would backfire, giving me the chance to speak honestly about who she truly was, rather than allowing rumor to define her memory unanswered." "Bertrand will have Lord Varric's connections investigated thoroughly," Cale said. "If we can prove House Ashgrove funded this accusation, even indirectly, it will provide grounds for consequences, considerably more severe than the concessions Lord Ashgrove has already offered, following his daughter's actions." Morella, who had observed the entire proceeding from a quiet corner of the chamber, approached as the last of the nobles filed out, her expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "This will not be the last such attempt," she said, without preamble. "You have proven yourself capable of weathering direct threats and violence, Illyra, and now capable, too, of weathering political rumor and manufactured scandal. But those determined to prevent this registration will continue searching for new avenues of attack, so long as any weakness remains for them to exploit." "What weakness remains?" Illyra asked, genuinely uncertain what more could be used against her, beyond fabricated accusations about a mother who could no longer defend her own memory. "The formal ceremony itself," Morella said. "It is not yet complete. Until Cale claims you fully, publicly, before the entire kingdom, there remains a window, however narrow, for those determined to prevent this union to attempt one final, desperate effort at disruption. I would advise increased caution as the ceremony approaches, rather than assuming today's victory has closed every avenue against you." The warning settled uneasily over Illyra as she made her way back toward her chamber that evening, the exhausting confrontation of the council session giving way to renewed vigilance as she considered Morella's caution. Bertrand's investigation into Lord Varric's claims moved quickly over the following days, and by the end of the week, he arrived at Cale's study with findings that confirmed exactly the suspicions raised during the council session. The soldier Lord Varric claimed had provided his testimony did exist, a real man who had indeed served during the Northern Uprising, but when Bertrand's own agents located him living quietly on a small farm in the western provinces, he denied ever speaking to Lord Varric or providing any testimony regarding a healer at Thornwood Pass. "He was paid," Bertrand reported grimly, laying out the evidence before Cale and Illyra. "Not for false testimony directly, but for his silence regarding the fact that no such testimony was ever given. Lord Varrick's agents approached him with a generous sum, asking only that he not contradict any claims made in his name, should the matter ever be questioned. The old soldier grew uneasy enough with the arrangement, once he understood its scope, that he was willing to speak honestly when my agents found him. "And the connection to House Ashgrove?" Cale asked. "Confirmed as well," Bertrand said. "Lord Varrick's family holds significant debts to House Ashgrove, debts accumulated over several years of poor harvests on his own lands. It required little imagination to understand why he might agree to manufacture such an accusation, particularly when Lord Ashgrove's agents suggested those debts might be forgiven in exchange for his cooperation." Illyra absorbed this information with a complicated mixture of relief and renewed anger. Relief that her mother's memory had been fully cleared of any true connection to the old rebellion. Anger that House Ashgrove, despite Lord Ashgrove's carefully worded apology and generous concessions following his daughter's actions, appeared willing to continue pursuing schemes against her through more distant, deniable channels. "Lord Ashgrove claimed to know nothing of Cassandra's plans," Illyra said slowly. "Do you believe he knows more about this second attempt than he claimed regarding the first?" Cale's expression darkened at the question. "I intend to find out directly," he said. "Bertrand, arrange for a formal summons. I want Lord Ashgrove brought before this council personally, to answer for whatever role his house continues to play in these repeated attempts to derail a registration this council has already approved." The summons was sent immediately, and Lord Ashgrove arrived at the palace within 4 days, his expression carrying none of Cassandra's earlier defiance, but instead a weary resignation that suggested he understood exactly how precarious his house's standing had become. He answered the council's questions directly, admitting, with visible reluctance, that certain members of his extended household had continued pursuing efforts against Illyra's registration without his direct knowledge, though he acknowledged too that his own public statements following Cassandra's exposure had perhaps not gone far enough in discouraging such continued interference. "I will make it unmistakably clear," Lord Ashgrove said before the assembled council, "that any further action taken by anyone connected to House Ashgrove against Illyra, her family's memory, or her formal registration, will result in complete severance of our house's standing at court, regardless of the personal or financial cost such severance might carry. I have already lost my daughter's place at court through her own choices. I do not intend to lose everything else my family has built through the continued foolishness of distant allies acting without my sanction." The formal declaration, delivered before the full council, carried enough weight that even the nobles who had seemed most receptive to Lord Varrick's earlier accusations appeared satisfied that House Ashgrove's interference had finally, genuinely, been brought to an end. Lord Varrick himself was quietly stripped of several minor court privileges as punishment for his manufactured testimony, though Cale, in a gesture that surprised Illyra, declined to pursue harsher consequences, noting that a man drowning in debt, who had been offered an easy way out, bore less true malice than genuine desperation, however poor his judgment in accepting House Ashgrove's offer had ultimately proven. With the immediate political threat finally resolved, the palace's attention turned fully toward the approaching ceremony, and Illyra found herself, in the final days before the registration, increasingly preoccupied not with fear of further sabotage, but with the simple, overwhelming weight of what she was about to formally undertake. She would stand before the entire assembled court, before nobles and commoners alike who had traveled from across the kingdom to witness the moment, and declare, publicly and permanently, her place beside the throne. "Are you frightened?" Cale asked her, the night before the ceremony, as they walked together through the quiet garden where their bond had first truly begun to take shape. "Terrified," Illyra admitted honestly, though a smile touched her mouth despite the admission. "But not in the way I once was, hiding behind that market stall, desperate to disappear before anyone could see me. This fear feels different. It feels like standing at the edge of something enormous and wonderful, rather than something simply dangerous." "That sounds like courage to me," Cale said, drawing her close against his side as Fenris padded quietly ahead of them along the familiar garden path. "Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward regardless of it." "Perhaps," Illyra said, leaning into his warmth, as the autumn evening settled cool and clear around them. "Whatever it is, I would not trade this fear for the safety of hiding, not anymore. I've learned, these past 2 months, that hiding was never truly safety at all, only a smaller, quieter kind of danger, one that cost me chances at happiness I never even knew I was missing. They lingered in the garden a while longer, the weight of the following day's ceremony settling over them both, not as a burden, but as the natural culmination of everything they had weathered together since that first, unexpected meeting in a crowded market square. Before returning to her chamber for the night, Illyra stopped by the small room set aside for her herbal work, gathering a few dried sprigs of lavender that she tucked carefully into a small pouch, a quiet tradition her mother had once observed before any significant occasion, a gesture meant to carry calm and clarity into whatever challenge the following day might bring. She smiled faintly at the memory, wishing, not for the first time since arriving at the palace, that her mother could have lived to see this moment, to witness her daughter standing at the threshold of a life neither of them could ever have imagined during those quiet years in the eastern hills. Odalise arrived early the next morning, well before dawn had fully broken over the palace grounds, accompanied by 2 assistants carrying the finished gown that had been the product of weeks of careful fitting and fabric selection. The deep green silk caught the early candlelight as they dressed her, simple in its elegance, despite the fine craftsmanship woven into every seam, and Illyra found herself studying her reflection in the tall mirror, with a strange sense of both recognition and transformation, the woman looking back at her both entirely herself and someone new entirely, forged through 2 months of fear and courage in equal measure. "You look every bit as strong as the day you stood before that council and defended your mother's memory," Odalise said, adjusting a final fold of fabric with practiced hands. "The kingdom will see that strength today, my lady, whatever fine silk you happen to be wearing while they witness it." Morella arrived shortly after, offering a final word of quiet encouragement before the ceremony began, and Bertrand, too, found a moment to wish her well, his earlier careful neutrality having long since given way to genuine, steady support that Illyra had come to value deeply over the difficult weeks since their first uneasy encounter in the market square. As the appointed hour finally approached, Corwin escorted her toward the grand hall where the formal ceremony would take place, and Illyra felt her heart pounding steadily, not with the paralyzing fear that had once sent her scrambling behind crates of grain, but with something closer to anticipation, a readiness to finally, fully claim the life she had chosen for herself. And as the last light faded from the evening sky the night before, Illyra had found herself, despite every trial that had led to this moment, genuinely and completely ready for whatever tomorrow would bring, understanding, finally, that whatever final obstacles House Ashgrove or any other rival might yet attempt, she no longer faced them as a frightened girl seeking only to remain unseen, but as a woman prepared, at last, to claim her place fully in the light. The grand hall had never held so many people, or so Illyra was told by the servants who whispered excitedly as they made final preparations, nobles from every corner of the kingdom filling the rows of polished seating, alongside commoners who had traveled great distances simply to witness the moment their Alpha King formally claimed the woman whose story had, by now, spread through every corner of the realm, the market stall, the wolf who broke formation, the threats survived, and the schemes overcome. Illyra waited in a small antechamber adjoining the hall, her heart pounding steadily as she listened to the murmur of the enormous crowd beyond the heavy doors, and found herself, in these final moments before the ceremony began, thinking back over the entire journey that had brought her to this threshold. The terrified girl who had ducked behind a market stall felt, in some ways, like an entirely different person from the woman now standing in fine green silk, waiting to be called forward before the assembled kingdom, and yet Illyra understood, with quiet clarity, that both versions of herself remained true. The careful caution that had once kept her safe, now transformed into the steady courage that would carry her through whatever remained ahead. "It's time," Corwin said gently, appearing at the antechamber door with an expression that carried both formal respect and genuine warmth, the culmination of 2 months spent guarding her through danger and uncertainty in equal measure. "His Majesty is waiting." Illyra took a final steadying breath and stepped through the doors into the grand hall. The sight that greeted her stole whatever composure she had carefully gathered in the antechamber. The hall stretched vast and magnificent before her, banners of red and black hanging from every column, sunlight streaming through tall stained glass windows to scatter jeweled light across the assembled crowd, Every face turned toward her, as she began the long walk down the central aisle, toward the raised dais, where Cale waited. He stood tall and resplendent in formal robes befitting the occasion, but it was his expression, not his fine clothing, that steadied Elira's racing heart as she walked toward him, his eyes carrying the same warm, unwavering certainty she had first glimpsed in the market square so many weeks earlier, as though nothing in the enormous hall existed for him beyond the sight of her approaching. Fenris stood beside the dais as well, his massive form settled in a posture of quiet dignity, his golden eyes tracking her every step with the same watchful devotion he had shown since the very beginning. Elira reached the base of the dais, and Cale descended to meet her, extending his hand exactly as he had done twice before, once in a crowded market square, once in a quiet garden courtyard, though this time, the gesture carried the full weight of everything that had passed between them since those earlier, more uncertain moments. "Elira," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, formal in cadence but warm in every underlying tone. "Before this court, and before the kingdom I have sworn to serve, I ask you once more, freely and without pressure, will you accept this bond, and stand beside me as my mate, my partner, and my equal in all things?" Elira placed her hand in his, feeling the familiar warmth of his grip steady the last of her nervous trembling, and found her voice carrying clearly across the vast, silent hall. "I will," she said, "not because fate or bond compels me toward it, but because I have chosen this, freely and completely, with full understanding of everything it will ask of us both." A murmur of approval rippled through the assembled crowd, and Bertrand, standing at the edge of the dais in his ceremonial capacity as the crown's most senior advisor, stepped forward to complete the formal words of registration, his voice carrying none of the cold formality Elira remembered from their earliest uneasy encounters, but instead, a genuine pride that surprised her even now, weeks after his loyalty had become so clearly, unmistakably certain. "By the authority vested in this council, and witnessed before the full assembly of this kingdom's nobility and people," Bertrand declared, "let it be known that Elira, daughter of Marin the Healer, is formally and permanently recognized as mate to His Majesty King Cale Draven, entitled to all rights, protections, and standing such recognition confers, from this day forward, without exception or challenge." The formal words settled over the hall with the weight of finality, and Elira felt something in her chest ease completely, the last lingering thread of uncertainty that had followed her since that first terrified moment in the market square finally, fully dissolving into simple, overwhelming joy. Cale drew her close, and the crowd erupted into genuine, thunderous applause, a sound so different from the tense, murmuring silence that had once greeted her first, unexpected appearance before this same court. Fenris let out a deep, satisfied sound that rumbled through the hall like distant thunder, and pressed himself against them both, and Elira, laughing despite the tears that had gathered unbidden in her eyes, reached down to rest her hand against his thick fur, remembering with sudden, vivid clarity the first moment he had found her hiding behind crates of grain, uncertain then what his strange, gentle attention could possibly mean. "You knew," she said softly, meant only for Cale and the great wolf beside them, though her voice carried enough that those nearest the dais could hear it clearly. "Both of you knew, from that very first moment, exactly what this would become." "We hoped," Cale corrected gently, his own eyes bright with emotion he made no effort to hide before the assembled court. "Hope and certainty are different things, Elira, and I confess I spent many uncertain nights these past 2 months, wondering whether the dangers and difficulties we face together might prove too great a burden for even the strongest bond to bear. But you never wavered, not truly, not even when threats and schemes and cruel rumor sought to drive you away. You chose this, again and again, through every trial that might have sent someone with less courage running back toward the safety of hiding." The formal ceremony continued for some time after, additional rites and blessings performed according to tradition, gifts presented by various noble houses, eager to demonstrate their goodwill toward the newly registered mate of their king, though Elira found much of it passing in a warm, joyful blur, her attention fixed primarily on Cale beside her, and the steady, reassuring presence of Fenris at their feet. She caught glimpses, throughout the proceedings, of familiar faces among the crowd, Morella watching with quiet pride from a place of honor near the front rows, Corwin standing at careful attention nearby, ready as always to ensure her safety even amid the joyful celebration. When the formal proceedings finally concluded, and the enormous crowd began filing from the grand hall toward the feast prepared in the palace's outer courtyards, Kale drew Alira aside for a brief private moment before they too would need to join the celebration awaiting them. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly, searching her face with the same careful attentiveness he had shown since their very first conversation in the palace garden. Alira considered the question seriously, taking stock of everything she felt in this quiet, private moment before the wider celebration claimed their attention fully. "Free," she said finally, surprising herself slightly with the word, though the moment she spoke it, she understood its truth completely. "Not free from responsibility, or even from danger, since I imagine some challenges will always exist for someone standing in the position I have now formally accepted. But free from the fear that once governed nearly every choice I made. I don't have to hide anymore, Kale. Not from you, not from this court, not from whatever comes next." "You never truly needed to hide," Kale said softly, drawing her close. "Not from the moment Fenris found you behind that market stall. I think some part of me recognized, even then, exactly how much strength and light you carried within you, hidden away behind fear that the world had taught you to feel necessary. I am simply grateful that I had the chance to help you discover it fully, rather than watching you spend your whole life keeping it carefully, sadly concealed." They stepped out together into the golden afternoon light of the palace courtyard, where the feast had already begun, music and laughter, and the warm, celebratory energy of an entire kingdom, rejoicing in a story that had captured its imagination since that very first day the king's wolf broke formation in a crowded market square. Alira moved through the celebration at Kale's side, no longer the frightened girl who had once crouched behind crates of grain hoping desperately to remain unseen, but a woman who had faced threats and schemes and cruel rumor, and emerged from every trial not diminished, but stronger, standing now fully, finally, in the light she had once believed too dangerous to claim. As evening fell over the palace grounds, the celebration continuing long into the night beneath strings of glowing lanterns, Alira found a quiet moment to slip away toward the garden, where her bond with Kale had first begun to truly take shape, Fenris padding faithfully beside her as she settled onto the familiar stone bench, overlooking the wild tree line beyond the palace walls. She thought of her mother, of the small cottage in the eastern hills that had once represented the entirety of her careful, hidden world, and felt a quiet, grateful peace settle over her, understanding that whatever had been sacrificed in leaving that quiet life behind, she had gained something far greater in its place. A partnership built not on fear or obligation, but on genuine love, tested through fire and threat and proven, again and again, to be strong enough to weather whatever challenges still lay ahead. Kale found her there a short while later, settling beside her on the familiar bench, and together they watched the stars emerge gradually over the palace grounds, the distant sounds of celebration still drifting faintly on the evening breeze. "I have a gift for you," Kale said, reaching into his robes to produce a small, carved wooden box, simple in its design, compared to the elaborate presents offered earlier by various noble houses eager to demonstrate their goodwill. Alira opened it carefully and found inside a pendant carved from pale wood, shaped delicately into the form of a small wolf, its craftsmanship humble but clearly made with great care. "I carved it myself," Kale admitted, a touch of shyness entering his voice that Alira found unexpectedly endearing in a man who commanded an entire kingdom with such natural authority. "It is not fine gold or jewels, I know, but I wanted to give you something made by my own hands, rather than simply purchased to match the grandeur everyone expects of a king's gift." "It's perfect," Alira said, and meant it completely, closing her fingers around the small carving with genuine emotion. "More perfect than any jewel could ever be." She fastened it carefully beside the wooden pendant her mother had left her, the two small treasures resting together against her heart, one representing the quiet life she had come from, the other the extraordinary life she had chosen to build. Morella found them a while later, making her way slowly through the garden with the careful, measured steps of someone who had spent the entire day on her feet, celebrating alongside the rest of the court, though her sharp eyes carried the same warm satisfaction Alira had come to associate with the old scholar's quiet approval. "I wish to give you something as well," she said, producing the same worn book she had gifted weeks earlier, though now it carried a new inscription on its opening page, written in Morella's careful, precise hand. I have added your own story to its pages, child, alongside those who came before you. I believe future generations will find as much wisdom in your courage as you found in theirs. Illyra accepted the book with genuine gratitude, understanding the significance of what Morella offered, not simply a record of history, but an acknowledgement that her own journey, born from fear and transformed through courage, now stood alongside the great bonded pairs, whose stories had shaped the kingdom's understanding of what such connections could truly mean. Bertrand, too, made his way to the garden before the evening fully deepened into night, his formal robe slightly rumpled from the long day's celebrations, though his expression carried none of the careful neutrality that had once defined nearly every interaction Illyra had shared with him. "I owe you an apology," he said simply, once he had settled onto a nearby bench, "not for my earlier caution, which I still believe served its purpose in testing the strength of a bond that needed to prove itself against genuine adversity. But for ever doubting, even briefly, that a woman capable of such quiet, steady courage could prove herself worthy of the crown's trust. I see now how foolish that doubt truly was." "You were only trying to protect the kingdom you've served your whole life," Illyra said gently. "I understand that now, far better than I did during our first uneasy encounters. I don't hold your earlier caution against you, Bertrand. If anything, I'm grateful for it, in its own strange way. It taught me to prove my worth through action, rather than simply expecting trust to be freely given." As the night deepened fully around them, the distant sounds of celebration gradually quieting as the vast crowd of nobles and commoners alike began making their way toward rest after the long, joyful day, Illyra found herself alone once more, with Cale and Fenris, in the quiet garden that had witnessed so much of their journey together, from uncertain first conversations to this final, settled peace. She thought of the long road that had brought her here, the terrified girl who had ducked behind a market stall, the frightened guest who had first walked these palace halls uncertain of her place within them, the woman who had faced threats and schemes and cruel rumor, and emerged, through every trial, stronger rather than diminished. Illyra leaned into Cale's warmth, Fenris curling contentedly at their feet, and understood, with complete and settled certainty, that whatever came next, in the life stretching before her, she would face it not as a girl hiding behind a market stall, but as a queen who had chosen, freely and completely, to stand fully in the light beside the man and the wolf who had found her, and who would never again let her disappear into the shadows she had once believed were her only safety. The stars stretched bright and endless above the palace grounds, and Illyra, resting quietly against the steady heartbeat of the man she loved, felt, for the first time in her entire life, completely and unshakably home.